Good evening. On behalf of the London Review of Books, I would first like to welcome you here. Secondly, I would like to thank you for your enormous patience. I'm very sorry that it has taken so long to get you in here and that has delayed the start of the evening. Finally, I would like to introduce you to our moderator for this evening's debate, Anne-Marie Slaughter. Thank you.
Good evening. Let me begin by introducing our panelists, and I'm assuming they're going to walk out here a little like a game show. Our first panelist, Shlomo Ben-Ami, who is a former Israeli foreign and security minister and the author of Scars of War. Our second panelist, Martin Indyk, who is the director of the Saban Center for Middle East Policy and senior fellow in foreign policy studies at Brookings. You're next. Tony Judt, who is the Erich Maria Remarque Professor in European Studies and director of the Remarque Institute at New York University. Rashid Khalidi is the Edward Said Professor of Arab Studies and Director of the Middle East Institute. John Mearsheimer is the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Service Professor of Political Science. Dennis Ross is the Counselor and Ziegler Distinguished Fellow of the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. I hope that's the end of the applause meter approach to this debate. Otherwise, we're not going to get very much said or heard. Let me explain the ground rules. I will open, then I will put an opening question. We're not going to have opening statements, and we will have a debate among the participants on stage. At some point, I will turn over to the audience toward the end for questions from the floor, although at this point it's going to be very hard for me to see you. So let me start by talking about the debate that I think many people in my world, the academic world, the foreign policy world, think would be valuable to hold. There are many people who think it would be valuable to have a debate about U.S. policy toward Israel, about Israeli policy toward the Palestinians, about U.S. and Israeli policy in the Middle East more broadly. More specifically, I'd like to quote from an article written by Daniel Levy, an Israeli who was a policy advisor in Ehud Barak's office. He wrote this article originally in Haaretz, and it was republished in the International Herald Tribune. He offered the following talking points for a debate. Efforts to collapse the Israeli and neoconservative agendas into one have been a terrible mistake, writes Daniel Levy. He says, second, Israel would do well to distance itself from our friends on the Christian evangelical right. Third, I'm quoting from Daniel Levy, Israel must not be party to the bullying tactics used to silence policy debate in the United States. And fourth, he writes, the lobby denies Israel something that many other countries benefit from, the excuse of external encouragement to do things that are politically tricky but nationally necessary. Those are topics that, as I said, many think it would be valuable to debate. That's not the debate that we've been having over the past few months since John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt published their article, The Israel Lobby, in the London Review of Books. We've had some of that debate in the pages of foreign policy. We've had a debate about what really drives a U.S. policy toward Israel. But we've also been having a debate about anti-Semitism, about treason, about the very fact that this article was written. I have concluded it's impossible to have the second debate without having at least some of the first debate. And this evening, we're going to open by trying to clear some of those issues and then turn to the more substantive issues in the article. So I'd like to open by asking John Mearsheimer, do you think your article was anti-Semitic?
Obviously, the answer to that is no. I don't think there's any evidence in the record that Steve Walt and I are anti-Semitic, and I don't think a case can be made that the piece is anti-Semitic. Moreover, I don't think Mary Kay Wilmers, who is the editor of the London Review of Books, would have published the piece if she thought we were anti-Semites or she thought the piece was anti-Semitic. Now, there are a variety of reasons why people sometimes think that the piece is anti-Semitic. Sometimes people think that when we talk about the lobby, we're talking about a cabal or an all-powerful conspiracy, or we're talking about Jews running the world. We went to great lengths in the piece, and we go to great lengths in our discussion of the piece to make it clear that that is not what we're talking about. Basically, what we're talking about here is an organized interest group. It's a loose group of individuals and organizations that work assiduously on behalf of Israel. And there is absolutely nothing wrong with that. What the lobby is doing is engaging in old-fashioned interest group politics.
Okay, John, I'm going to come back to you because I want to ask who the lobby is exactly. But I want to come back on the first question, whether or not the article is anti-Semitic. That's a separate question, I think, from whether you or Steve is anti-Semitic. But let's hear from the other side on the charge of anti-Semitism, since that really has been debated quite publicly. Martin.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. First of all, ladies and gentlemen, I have never accused any critic of Israel of
You have to speak a little.
I have never accused any critic of Israel of anti-Semitism in my long engagement in this kind of discussion. But I do believe that this piece rises or lowers itself to the level of anti-Semitism. And it's for precisely the reason that John Mearsheimer recites here. His definition of the lobby is this organized, loosely affiliated group of people that works assiduously on behalf of Israel. If he had written a paper about the lobby, which is about AIPAC, which is the lobby, then I wouldn't have had any problem with many of the things he had to say about AIPAC. But this notion of this loosely aligned group of people that all happen to be working assiduously for Israel is indeed a cabal, the very thing he says he's not referring to. It is exactly what he suggests. And this cabal, if you read the paper, includes anybody who has a positive thing to say about Israel. Editorial writers for the Wall Street Journal, institutions like the Brookings Institution, because I happen to be there, anybody who has anything to do with an opinion that might be pro-Israel is part of this cabal. And what does this cabal do, Anne-Marie? It distorts American foreign policy. It bends it. All these words are used to suggest that this cabal is doing something that is anti-American.
Okay, but let me come back in and here. So the argument here is because the lobby is very broad and suggests conspiracy and cabal, that's what makes it anti-Semitic. I want to hear other responses on that particular definition of anti-Semitism.
Not necessarily that particular definition, but you see, when you have a single cause explanation that addresses the Jews in particular, then you lend yourself, this is, I believe, deficient scholarship, not anti-Semitism, but you lend yourself to such an accusation because you lay the entire blame on the distortion of America's foreign policy, not really on the Israel lobby. I think this is not an article on the Israel lobby. I think the Israel lobby, the term here is a cover for the Jews, basically, and not the Christians. The Christians are a constituency, they are not a lobby. And in the case of the Jews, especially in the Republican administration, I don't believe they are a constituency. Now, there is also here an element of scapegoating, because which is again very dangerous, and they are on the verge of writing an article which is anti-Semitic because of this wagging the dog theory, because of scapegoating. The American politician is depicted here as innocent. He's the innocent abroad. He's Mark Twain's innocent. And there is a group of Jews that are sort of distorting, of imposing the interest of another nation. And there is also here the implicit accusation of double loyalty.
So, but
all this has anti-Semitic connotations. I believe the article is essentially bad scholarship. And
okay, we'll come back. We'll come back on that. But
it lends
bad
itself.
Scholarship, believe me, from the university, bad scholarship is not anti-Semitic. That would certainly increase the amount of anti-Semitism in the world.
I say that myself, but there are connotations.
I understand. But you said something very interesting, and you said it's on the verge of anti-Semitism. You can hear both of you as saying this article feeds anti-Semitism. This article feeds those who believe that the Jews are operating through a cabal, through a conspiracy, that it shouldn't have been written because it feeds anti-Semitism, which is a little different than saying the article itself accuses the Jews of being that way.
Anne-Marie, if I could just say something about that. Can you hear me?
Yes.
60 years ago, very near to this room, Arthur Koestler stood up and gave a lecture about what was then a fairly new phenomenon, that is the rise of the Cold War, the emergence of the Soviet bloc, and so on, and talked very angrily and very energetically about everything that was wrong with it, and wrong with communism and why you had to fight it. This, of course, from an ex-communist. And he was accused in the room, while he was speaking, of bringing aid and comfort to what was not yet called McCarthyism, but what was soon going to be McCarthyism. You're saying the kind of things that verge on McCarthyism, Nixonism, as it was then called. You shouldn't say this kind of stuff, it helps them. And his answer to that was very simple. You cannot help it if idiots and bigots share your views for their reasons. That doesn't mean that you can be tarred with their views. You have your views and they should be judged on their merits. And it worries me that the very first thing we do when someone writes a controversial essay, whatever its academic standing, about the Israel lobby, about relations between this country and Israel, the first question is not what is the truth or falsity of the substance of it, but how much does it come close to anti-Semitism? Does it help the anti-Semites? Should we not have said it because of the anti-Semitism issue? This seems to me to close down conversation in this country.
Dennis, it's really simple. We don't have as much time as we want, and the more you clap, the less you hear. You can make that choice, but that will be the choice, because it's going to take much longer to continue an actual debate. Dennis, you want to jump in, and I'll turn back to John?
Yeah, I'll keep it short. My problem is with the content of the article more than the suggestion that it verges on anti-Semitism. I have to admit there were places in it where I felt there was this tendency to create a very large umbrella where you group people together who have almost nothing in common. I can tell you that some of the people who you identify as the neocons were the greatest critics of Martin and me when we were trying to work for peace. But we are treated the same as them. Now, for me, when you begin to create that kind of a very broad umbrella, that does begin to raise questions about what it is you're doing. My problem, however, is much more with the content of what you say than with the reality of this broad umbrella, although I would suggest to you that you should take a much closer look at who you're lumping together in that group.
Oh, I'm going to turn to that next about the nature of the lobby itself. But let me let John come back.
I would appreciate if you just give me a few minutes because there are a lot of very important charges.
I'll give you some.
First of all, we made it very clear, Dennis, that there are divisions within the lobby, and there are all sorts of disagreements among
You have to,
people.
I think, speak.
There are all sorts of disagreements among people inside the lobby. Secondly, to talk about it as a cabal implies that there's something secretive, something surreptitious, something evil about it. And we were not making that argument at all. And in fact, we went to great lengths to say that we were not making that point. With regard to the charge of treason or dual loyalty, we did not talk about dual loyalty, and we never accused and would never accuse anyone of treason. The basic argument that we're making is that all people have multiple loyalties to religion, to family, to other countries, to the United States. And it's perfectly legitimate in the United States to have a certain attachment to another country and to promote that country's interests, as is in the case of Indian Americans, Armenian Americans, and Cuban Americans. And it's perfectly acceptable for people to do that on behalf of Israel. We're also not only talking about Jews, and we were not talking about all Jews. We went to great lengths to say that not all Jews are in the lobby, and the lobby is not exclusively comprised of Jews. But I want to conclude by reading a quick quote. Now, just let me read a quick quote from one of our harshest critics, Alan Dershowitz, which gets at the... it's one of the few things that he's written that I agree with, your former colleague. He wrote this in 1991 in the book Chutzpah. He said, "My generation of Jews became part of what is perhaps the most effective lobbying and fundraising effort in the history of democracy. We did a truly great job as far as we allowed ourselves and were allowed to go." That was Alan Dershowitz. And what Alan is telling you is that there is an Israel lobby out there, and it has one heck of a lot of influence.
But John, how is that different from what you just read? How's that different than saying all Jews are part of the Israel lobby?
We made it perfectly clear that all Jews are not part of the Israel lobby. And as I said with regard to Dennis, we made it very clear that there are divisions within the lobby on certain policy issues.
All right, so let me turn back to Martin. Suppose that the article had not been titled The Lobby. It had been titled The Influence of a Pro-Israel Lobby of Neoconservatives, Fundamentalist Evangelicals, and American Likudniks on American Policy in the Middle East. Would you have had the same reaction if that had been the title?
Listen, yes. But what I said to you, I would have no problem if Mearsheimer and Walt had done a decent scholarly critique of what is the lobby, that is, the American Israel Public Affairs Committee. But what they do is take that and expand it to cover people that have some view towards Israel that is mildly pro-Israel, in some cases critical of Israel, and they lump them all together in the lobby with a capital L, and then he says, oh yes, but we distinguish some people. But it's not true. They're all in there together as involved in some kind of cabal. And he says now it's not conspiratorial, but he uses conspiratorial words.
So you would...
He uses words like distort and bend. He calls me...
That's not conspiratorial.
Actually, the one thing I liked about the article is he called me ubiquitous.
And you wanted to...
No, I like it. But why use the word ubiquitous?
I often felt the same way.
All right, let Tony...
What is the use of that word about, if not a sense that there's a conspiracy going on here?
But so let me just establish, if he'd written the influence of AIPAC, you would not object.
No, if he'd done a scholarly job on it. It's a very
we'll come to the scholarship.
piece of scholarly work as well.
Tony.
Could I shift just a little bit the angle of the conversation?
Maybe.
All right, try me. Distort seems to me perfectly okay. The NRA distorts our policy in many ways as well. When John Bolton went to the United Nations Convention on the Illicit Trade in Small Arms and prevented it actually coming to a conclusion, he went along with 3 senior members of the NRA. I would say that distorted our foreign policy. I would also point out that when I wrote about that, no one landed on my head with whatever the anti-rifle equivalent of anti-Semitism is. And I think this is the crucial point about the Israel lobby, or the group of lobbyists, or whatever you want to say. There are hundreds of distorting lobbies. It's one of the ways in which our political system is defective. This is the only significant lobby I know of which not only acts to advance the interests of its cause, but acts constantly and very effectively to silence criticism of its cause. This is not the case of other lobbies.
Dennis?
I guess 2 points. One is, maybe, Tony, you haven't paid a whole lot of attention to the NRA. I think they're pretty good in terms of trying to silence their critics. Secondly, I think, again, I don't want to belabor this because I think I actually would like to deal with the content of the article more. But I would say, John, when you do say that there are differences, if the differences are as profound as Martin and I experienced, then I'm not quite sure what the lobby means. If people have an entirely different view about whether you should pursue peace, which we felt you should, or you shouldn't, then it seems to me you're talking about what are two very different kinds of constituencies. So how can they both be part of the Israeli lobby?
Rashid?
I think that there are several problems with the whole discussion that's preceded. And I think one of them has to do with a too narrow definition of what we're talking about here. We are not just talking about foreign policy. We should also be talking about American domestic legislation. We should also be talking about the public debate in this country. And if you have not noticed that in a debate on, say, women's rights or abortion, or in a debate on, say, the right to keep and bear arms, or the NRA, that there are two very clearly delineated sides in the public debate, then you haven't been watching American politics. If you believe that there are two sides to the debate in this country on this issue, you are out of your minds. There are not. In American political discourse, there is one side to this debate. In our Congress, there is one side to this debate. It's not true in foreign policy. It's another issue. I'll come to that in a minute. But insofar as public discourse is concerned, I think one of the things that has happened, and you can describe it as you will, it may have to do with the work that you did when you worked for AIPAC in the 80s and, you know, produced publications on the nefarious things that were happening on campus. It may have had to do with things that groups outside of AIPAC did. A number of organizations that were working in a variety of spheres since the 30s. You can go back to George Antonius and read what he says about how difficult it was to get a hearing in England as well as in this country. But there are not two sides to this debate in this country, and this is not just because it happens to be the case shall we say, the only United States interest in the Middle East is seeing things the way Israel sees.
Okay, now Rashid, your argument is actually far broader than even the argument I think that John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt were making.
It's one of my differences with John.
Okay. So,
you know, there are differences among many people on this panel announcement. It's not only between Dennis and Ambassador Ross and Ambassador Indyk and say... Dennis.
All right. Unless anybody wants a final comment on this, what I'd like
you know, it's obvious that this article is getting a huge amount of press time and a huge amount of debate, so I don't know where the censorship is coming in here. If it wasn't published in America, it was probably because it was such a dreadful piece of scholarship.
We're going to turn to the scholarship. Tony.
I'd just like to say one very quick thing about that. When I submitted an article, the debate that Mearsheimer and Walt kicked off, to a very well-known North American newspaper, I was asked by the editorial directors, would I mind telling them am I Jewish or not? They felt it was something they would like to know before they published it.
But they published it.
I told them I was Jewish.
Martin, you said you would have been perfectly happy if the title had been AIPAC and its influence.
The focus had been on AIPAC and its influence.
Okay. But if it had been clearly about AIPAC rather than the lobby, but then you said as long as as long as it had been a scholarly job. So do you want to elaborate on the where you see the defects in the scholarship? Not all of them, please. And let me come back to John.
First of all, let me start with the kind of tendentiousness of the article, in which it states that it's based on scholarly work and it's only presenting facts that are not in dispute. That's how the piece starts. Well, there are a hell of a lot of facts that are in dispute. One of the people that they quote is Benny Morris, they use here. He says, "Were the Israel lobby and US foreign policy," the name of the article, "an actual person, I would have to say that he did not have a single honest bone in his body." And why does he say that? It's because the facts are taken selectively and then distorted. This is particularly the case when it comes to what I think is the most important argument they try to make, which is about how the Israel lobby was responsible for taking this nation to war in Iraq. And that is completely bogus. And what they managed to do is, first of all, they cite a couple of Israelis, not the Israel lobby. There is no evidence there whatsoever in the article of what the Israel lobby did, AIPAC that is, to take this nation to war. There is selective quote of some Israelis, although there were many Israelis who had a real problem about this country going to war against Iraq because they considered the real threat to Israel Iran. And then they then take neoconservatives who were definitely in favour of the war in Iraq, but because they happen to be Jewish, they're named there as part of the lobby. And so on that basis, they then conclude that the lobby had a critical role. The role of the oil lobby, the role of the Arab states, the role of the president and the vice president doesn't come into this, except the president and vice president are simply manipulated by this all-powerful Israel lobby. And it's not based on accepted facts. It's based on this whole notion that there's this all-powerful lobby out there distorting the national interest.
Okay, John, I am going to give you a chance to respond. I promise you. Shlomo wants to come in.
Well, yes, I indeed think that they could have done a far better job in terms of scholarship, as I said before. And there are so many cases where it wouldn't stand the standard, I believe, of a serious paper to begin with. Most of the sources are of secondary nature. Another is, again, if we go to the war in Iraq, the proofs that Israel was interested or pushed for it or pressed for it, you bring, I think, the case of Benjamin Netanyahu and Ehud Barak writing articles. I am a far less important person in the history of peacemaking in Israel, but I also wrote an article in the Jerusalem Post before the war, 10 pages, where I opposed the idea of going to war. So I don't know why Ehud Barak's article had an impact on American foreign policy, and my very humble article went unnoticed. I think both of them were not important for the decision to go to war. And then you have Minister Ben-Eliezer saying clearly, he was the Minister of Defense, saying that for as far as Israel is concerned, Iran is the problem, not Iraq. And this was the foreign minister at the time, the defense minister at the time. And again, the question of democracy. I'm sure you know that, but for the case of Natan Sharansky, most Israelis, policymakers, people in politics, believe this is a neocon fancy that has no meaning at all for the region. Israel is against the idea of democratization. This is a lunacy that was propagated, and we see the results. And therefore, this is not an attitude of Israel. Every democracy in the Middle East right now is bound to be to create instability, and nobody's interested in that.
Let me stop you there on the war, because we've heard. I mean, that's a very clear charge, and it's certainly a charge in the article, that where we've got charges that this is not right, this is not good scholarship. What do you say?
Well,
you think it's good scholarship, but what do you say?
In the piece, we amply documented the argument that Israel and its leaders were strongly in favor of the war. That certain
you have to pull it. You have to pull the mic really close to you.
Turn it down.
Down like that.
Yeah.
Is that better?
Yes.
Sorry. In the piece, we documented at great length that Israel and its leaders were staunchly in favor of the war, that powerful institutions in the lobby were in favor of the war. And I'll just quote a few things to drive my point home. Recently, Bill Clinton said, this is in the summer, that every Israeli politician I knew believed that Saddam Hussein had to be taken out. That's Bill Clinton talking this summer, and we provided ample
typical of your tendencies.
Excuse me.
Martin, let him finish. Let him finish.
Because you take his quote completely out of context.
Let him finish. You will have a chance.
This is something of an unfair fight because two people get to make rather lengthy comments.
I'm standing on your side. Keep talking.
Thank you. But I would appreciate it if you'd give me the chance to answer. So there's no question that the Israelis were pushing very hard. There's also no question that the Israeli leadership viewed Iran as a greater threat than Iraq. But the fact of the matter is they viewed Iran, Iraq, and Syria as all threats, and although they would have rather taken out Iran first, they were perfectly content to take out Iraq first because they knew Iran and Syria were number 2 and number 3 on the hit list.
But John, what do you say specifically on the... I'm going to give you a chance. I just want to hear you answer the charge that the defense minister, who is a high Israeli official, Shlomo says he was opposed.
He said that the defense minister was more in favor of getting Iran than he was in favor of getting Iraq. That was Ben Elazir, and he's absolutely correct, and we cite that in the piece. We talk about his views. There is no question that the Israeli elite preferred to deal with Iran before they dealt with Iraq. But my point is, when they saw the direction that the United States was going in with regard to Iraq, they're perfectly willing to go along with that, provided we dealt with Iran and Syria after we dealt with Iraq, which was all part of the game plan. So that's point one. Point two, with regard to the major institutions inside the lobby, this is a quote that was in the piece from the foreword that's worth reading. It comes from May 2004, and the foreword editorial reads like this. As President Bush attempted to sell the war in Iraq, America's most important Jewish organizations rallied as one to his defense. In statement after statement, community leaders stressed the need to rid the world of Saddam Hussein and his weapons of mass destruction. It then goes on to say, concern for Israel's safety rightfully factored into the deliberations of the main Jewish groups. Now let me conclude by pointing out that there were also a number of people, very prominent people with access to the government at the time, who said that Israel was a major consideration, if not the major consideration, in the decision to go to war. Let me read to you what Wesley Clark said before the war. Second, those who favor this attack now will tell you candidly and privately that it is probably true that Saddam Hussein is no threat to the United States. But they are afraid that at some point he might decide, if he had a nuclear weapon, to use it against Israel. Philip Zelikow, who is now a counselor to Condoleezza Rice, said in a famous talk at the University of Virginia in the fall of 2002 that the threat that was driving the United States was not the threat to the United States, it was the threat to Israel. And let me conclude with a quote from Joe Klein in Time magazine, February 10th, 2003. A stronger Israel is very much embedded in the rationale for war with Iraq. It is part of the argument that dare not speak its name. a fantasy quietly cherished by the neoconservative faction in the Bush administration and by many leaders of the American Jewish community, which of course is what the forward editorial said. So the idea that Steve and I were making this up is simply wrong. There is much documentation out there to support our contention that the Israel lobby was not the only force behind the war. In fact, we make the argument very clearly that you would not have had a war had it not been for 9/11 and its effect on President Bush and Vice President Cheney. Not get the war started. But it seems very clear to me and very clear to other people that the Israel lobby was one of the principal driving forces behind the Iraq war, and in its absence, we probably would not have had a war.
Okay. Dennis.
Look, I think you touched on you touched on what is really the key issue: causation. You did one quote. You offered one quote where you said, "Bush is selling," and in effect, the Jewish lobby was supporting. Bush was selling. Bush made the decisions. Without 9/11, as you just said, there wouldn't have been a war.
We said that in the piece.
All right, but you're also saying now, you didn't in the original piece.
In the original piece.
In the original piece, that's not what you said. In the foreign policy piece, you said it. In the original piece, your focus is much more on the Israeli lobby being behind the war. Now, the point here is, if you're looking at causation, 2 points to make. Point number one, without 9/11, Bush's whole approach is different. In fact, when the administration came in, their policy was smart sanctions. It was about containing Iraq. It wasn't about regime change. 9/11 changed their view of the world. The same day, 9/11, 90 minutes after the attack on the Pentagon, Rumsfeld is making notes focused on Saddam Hussein and talking about hitting Saddam Hussein. No Israel lobby there. That's done Rumsfeld. Number one. Number two, it matters who's in the Oval Office. If George Bush hadn't been the president and Al Gore had been the president, you wouldn't have had a war there regardless of what the lobby's position was, and Al Gore was much closer to the lobby, in quotes, than George Bush. So if you're going to deal with causation, let's look at the real root causes and then not look for those outside of that and say, gee, they provided rationale.
This is actually an issue where I differ with John and Steve, but I don't want to talk about that.
You have to speak.
I'm sorry. This is actually an issue where I differ with John and Steve. I don't want to go into how I differ with them. But I think that anyone who argues that the not just AIPAC, but a number of major organizations aligned with AIPAC, you can call them the lobby, you can call them whatever you want, were extraordinarily supportive of this war, would be grievously mistaken. There were very few voices in the community that is consistently and regularly supportive of Israel that weren't vigorously supportive of this war. Now, I actually believe, and I've said it in a book that I've published, that there were a variety of reasons for this war, which, in my view, did not primarily include the lobby. I disagree with you on this, actually. However, and I think this is extraordinarily important, the degree to which the public debate in this country has been shifted, insofar as our whole understanding of the Middle East, has a lot to do with a much broader definition, I would argue, of the lobby. And I have to go back to the first thing I said. If we narrowly focus on foreign policy and do not understand that we are talking about the broader environment in this country and how we understand and mainly misunderstand the Middle East, then unfortunately I think it's a little too narrow. Now, one of the reasons that it was so easy for George Bush and his administration to turn on a dime after 9/11 is because of the things that had been created in the public mind about not just Iraq, but also Iran, also Syria, also the PLO, also Hamas, also. And I have to say, to some extent, we are discussing this thing too narrowly. We are discussing our understanding not just of what the lobby does and how it affects policy, but we are not really looking at it broadly enough. And I don't blame Steve and John for this. They are IR specialists. they are looking at foreign policy decisions. To some extent, that's also true of Martin and Dennis. That's the field they work
Rashid, the next debate, I'm not volunteering to moderate it, but the next debate could be about the broader issue. I think there are plenty of things still to debate with respect to this article. I want to move beyond the Iraq War. I mean, we've heard both sides on the extent to which it was a factor, it was the factor, it was the principal factor, and it's clearly very relevant to John and Steve's claim of the power of the lobby. I want to put the question a slightly different way and agree that we're talking about AIPAC for right now, and talk about what kind of power AIPAC does have, not about whether or not it caused the Iraq War, but whether it's credible to claim, as John and Steve do, that they have tremendous power. So, Martin, I want to come back to you. You recently published a very good op-ed on the need for massive aid to rebuild Lebanon, that it would be in U.S. interests, obviously, to counter Hezbollah, to provide immediate massive aid. And you suggested that Israel ought to ask Washington to reallocate some of its annual $2.3 billion in American military assistance to Lebanon. So you're suggesting that Israel ought to ask Washington to reallocate part of that money. So my question is, would assuming that has to go through Congress, do you think that that bill would go through Congress?
Unfortunately, the administration never tested the proposition, so it's a little hard to say. It's a hypothetical question. I think that it really touched on a whole range of things. There is no question that AIPAC is a very powerful lobby. They are quite proud of their power. They advertise it. They fundraise on the basis of it. There's no disputing that. And the administration and successive administrations have used AIPAC's power.
You have to lower it slightly. There you go.
Successive administrations have used AIPAC's power on the Hill, not only for the sake of Israel's aid, but for Egypt's aid, for Jordan's aid, for aid to the Palestinians, Palestinian Authority and the PLO, for the whole foreign aid budget would not pass without AIPAC's influence. The whole free trade agreement process was started with the US-Israel free trade agreement. Why? Because that was the only way that we're talking about the Reagan administration, could get it through Congress, was with AIPAC's help. And once they established a free trade agreement with Israel, it became possible to get free trade agreements, and that was the precursor to NAFTA and so on. So what am I saying here is to answer your particular question, I think it would have been possible to get AIPAC to support the very idea that I was putting forward. There wasn't anybody who criticized me for it. Maybe they thought I was completely crazy. But you know, the other point, of course, is that how come if I'm the ubiquitous, part of this cabal, am I suggesting that Israel might actually cut its aid to help Lebanon? How does that fit with the theory of the cabal?
So we got two issues on the table. The first is...
Unless, of course, I'm so clever. That's probably John's answer, that I did it to create the cover.
Well, there are two issues. One is the power of AIPAC as a lobby and the extent to which that advances U.S. interests or Israel's interests, which I want to come back to. But the other is, once again, the reaction to the article precisely that what Martin is attributing to AIPAC, he says you're attributing to him. Are you?
The power that I'm attributing...
Yeah, he's saying, look, this is AIPAC's agenda. This is not my agenda, but you say he's part of the Israel lobby.
Again, I want to be very clear. We emphasized in the piece that the lobby is a loose coalition of individuals and organizations, And moreover, we made it clear that there are differences among organizations and individuals in that lobby. With regard to Martin, I don't know exactly what all his views are vis-a-vis AIPAC. He was the deputy director of research at AIPAC. Then he was the co-founder of WINEP, the Washington Institute, which Dennis now serves at, in 1985, and which is closely affiliated with AIPAC. And I don't, in my own head, view Martin as being significantly different than AIPAC, but I don't know all Martin's views or all AIPAC's views for that matter.
There you have it.
Tony. Oh, actually, Shlomo first, and then Tony.
I think perhaps the point should be made about the limits of
you have to speak right into the
limits of the influence of a lobby. It seems to me that a lobby, whatever lobby, including a powerful lobby like AIPAC, has an influence if it is attuned to the policies of the administration at the time, not if it goes against it frontally. And we had so many cases. For example, during the first Bush, when the lobby clashed frontally with the president prevailed, not the lobby. And when Benjamin Netanyahu, as prime minister, tried to mobilize the lobby against President Clinton, he was dragged to Y, to sign the Y plantation agreement against the will of Israel and that of the lobby. And again, if it were not for Bush father, maybe even that Shamir would have won the elections. In fact, he toppled Shamir against the will of the lobby at the time. And we have so many cases where these worked that way. Did you see, for example, the lobby doing anything with regard to the far-reaching concessions that Clinton proposed on Jerusalem? Did you see the lobby prevailing over moving the embassy to Jerusalem? I mean, there is hardly one case where a lobby can change the policy. It can only surf on it, fine-tune it, not change it, not force its will on it.
All right, Tony, and then Dennis, and then I'll come back to you.
2 quick points. I mean, the first on what Shlomo Ben-Ami has just said, it doesn't quite gel with something he wrote very recently in a very important book he wrote, where he said that the only American presidents who have produced peace breakthroughs are those who've been ready to confront Israel head-on, and then he goes on to say, and overlook the sensibilities of her friends in America. And that puts the point the other way around. It means not that the lobby follows the president, but that a default condition is that the president does nothing to affront the lobby. And it's when you get the non-default condition...
This is not what I say.
Well, I'm reading your text.
This is not what I say. What I say is that there is a problem of leadership. It is up to the leader.
You have to speak right into the mic.
Lobbies are there. You have all kinds of lobbies. But you have a president. You have the intellectual profile of the president. There's nothing in this article about the intellectual profile. You have elected twice a president who is a political theologian without Jewish votes. This is entire American responsibility, almost exclusive American responsibility. He doesn't need a Jewish lobby to do the things that he does. So that's my argument. You need to be a leader. You were elected to be a leader. And therefore, what I say in the book is indeed that those who were deaf to these kind of pressures that are legitimate according to you were real leaders, and they did good for the peace process and for all kinds of good things in foreign policy.
But it seems to me in that case, if I may quickly summarize, what you're saying is that what would be good for Israel is for real American leaders to ignore the Israel lobby.
Yes, I'm going to come back to that.
Well, but I am a disciple of Yitzhak Rabin, who, on his first visit to the United States as Prime Minister, said to the lobby, let us do our foreign policy, don't interfere. And by the way, in the same vein of Martin Indyk's remark, he asked the lobby to lobby in Congress for funds for the Palestinians.
Can I come back to my second point now?
You can come back to your second point. I want to point out there's a separate and I think very important issue that has been more debated in Israel than it has been here, and it should be more here.
Like most things.
Fair point. But whether or not the lobby actually serves Israel's interests. That's a separate question. Right now, I do want to go back to you on the power of the lobby on American policy, and then we'll go back to
Which was exactly the main point I wanted to make, but I'm glad we're going to take up the other one. My main point was this, that while it's obviously an intelligent way to proceed, to say, okay, let's take a concrete example, the Iraq War, and let's see whether your account of how the lobby works really functioned in that case, and then have a discussion about it. I agree with Rashid Khalidi that this dangerously and wastefully, because it's a very unusual event we're in here, and it won't happen again, I assure you, very frequently, it wastes one opportunity we have, which is to ask a slightly different question. I'm not an international relations expert, and I'm not a realist political theorist, both of which I think the authors of this paper are. They talk about something called the national interest. And it seems to me that in a democracy, one of the ways, perhaps the only, in the long run, legitimate way in which something called the national interest gets determined is by public conversation about the various ways in which the country might behave or choose not to behave. And one of the conversations, it seems to me, that we don't have in this country is a conversation about our relationship with Israel. And the reason we don't have that conversation is because it's regarded by many people who might or might not be part of a lobby as unacceptable for reasons that we talked about at the beginning. That seems to me crucial, because without a discussion of that, we can't understand why the Israel lobby question is so controversial. If you're listening to these guys simply saying, well, maybe the Iraq war was started because of this and maybe that, we could have that conversation any day of the week in the pages of the Sun. That's not the issue.
All right, so Dennis?
Tony, I suspect that actually it was the issue that led Steve and John to write this. So that is a legitimate thing to be debating, since it seems to be what I think helped to trigger what they did.
No, I don't know if yours is on.
Yes, it is. Is it on? No. Do you hear me now? Can I do telephone commercials?
Yeah, you have to get really right up to it.
How's this?
Good.
All right. Anyway, what I was saying is that...
And now you got really right in. No, it's him.
How's this?
Good.
I like that. Look, it is legitimate to raise the Iraqi issue precisely because it's clearly one of the factors that motivated John and Steve. But I would get back to one other point. You know, the reality is administrations go administration by administration. Administrations did not make decisions based on what the lobby want. I was part of the first Bush administration. When it came to the issue of loan guarantees, we went against what the lobby wanted. In the Clinton administration, I can tell you, when we made peace process decisions, we made them based on what we thought was right. Had we been driven by the lobby, we never would have raised the proposals we did on Jerusalem, which, by the way, one point, John, to bear in mind. You say we never made an independent proposal? That's simply untrue. That is factually untrue. We made many independent proposals, and I can assure you the proposal to divide Jerusalem was certainly not one that the Israelis were keen to receive. So I think the key here is look at the various administrations. Now, it may well be that in this administration, you feel that there is a certain point of view that reflects what the lobby would favor. But I'll tell you something. This is an administration that if you want to use it as the example, you have a problem, because look at all the areas where it's, in a sense, it adopts policies that are different from its predecessors. If we look at the question of global warming, was the Israeli lobby responsible for their change on that? If we look at the question of the ABM treaty, was the Israeli lobby responsible for that? No, but my point is, if you single this administration out as the one that is your example of the proof of the lobby, you have to look at a lot of different behaviors. This administration is unique in a lot of its behaviors, and you can't attribute those unique behaviors to the Israeli.
We are then going to go to Tony's larger question of the extent to which we need that debate and can we have that debate. But part of that debate that we are having as a result of John and Steve's article does really go to how powerful is the lobby, and we've heard a bunch of examples where either Israelis have opposed the lobby or the lobby's tried to get things and hasn't gotten it. So I'd like to hear you respond on those questions, and we'll go to the larger issue.
A couple points. One is, Dennis, that Iraq actually did not motivate us to write the piece because we were commissioned to write it by the Atlantic Monthly in the fall of 2002, right before Iraq had heated up as an issue, and it was not what motivated us. What motivated us was events in April of 2002, and I'll talk a bit more about that in a second. Second, on the point that Tony makes that we don't have a conversation about this subject, or at least we heretofore have not had a conversation about the lobby and America's relationship with Israel. The principal reason that that is the case is because of the lobby, and any time anybody raised that subject, he or she is subjected to being called an anti-Semite, and therefore people are really afraid to discuss this issue. And I could point to all sorts of examples of people making that case. With regard to the influence of the lobby, I would just point out on the loan guarantees, Dennis, that actually Bush eventually caved in on the loan guarantees.
I was there. I wrote it.
Oh, he did cave in. Well, we can...
Wait, if you're going to object, do it publicly.
We offered loan guarantees after the Israelis met our conditions. That's when we offered the loan guarantees, not until they met the conditions, where we had a dollar-for-dollar reduction in the assistance.
Rashid, you can't just take his mic away.
I mean, this is the first case of a Palestinian giving permission to narrate.
You know, no, but it's okay, Rashid, because I've always believed in empowering Palestinians. Now, my point on the loan guarantees, we imposed conditions. We said from day one, when the Israelis came in, under Shamir, you can have loan guarantees, but you have to change your behavior on settlement. Shamir wasn't prepared to do it. He lost the election. Rabin came in. Rabin initially thought we would just grant the loan guarantees without conditions. We weren't prepared to do it, even with Rabin. We imposed conditions, and it produced a dollar-for-dollar reduction in assistance for the estimate we had of what they were spending on settlements. So we didn't cave on the loan guarantees. We imposed our conditions.
John.
Okay. I disagree with that. On the subject of settlements, which is the issue at hand, the fact of the matter is that every president since Lyndon Johnson has been opposed to settlements and said that settlements are a hindrance to peace. Yet no American president has been willing to do anything to prevent the Israelis from continuing to build settlements. And although George Bush tried to do that at first with the loan guarantees, the fact of the matter is he caved, and the Israelis continued to build settlements, and more settlements were built under the labor governments in the 1990s.
This is not the question. The question is if this is because of the lobby. This is the question.
No, the point is...
Were we allowed to continue building settlements because of the lobby?
No, that's not my argument at all. My point is that Israel had decided to build settlements. Okay? The United States government, the presidents of the United States from Lyndon Johnson forward, were opposed to those settlements.
Yes, okay.
The question is, why couldn't they prevent Israel from building those settlements?
Not because of the lobby.
Yes, because of the lobby.
No, of course not.
Why?
Why? Well,
why?
I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. Because, you see, one thing that doesn't exist in your article is Israel. Israel, as a counterpart, Israel is a counterpart of the United States.
Remember what I said about the Iraq War. I said that Israeli policymakers were pushing us to go to war in Iraq. You cannot say, Shlomo, that Israel is absent from our peace.
It's absent as an entity that has a current dialogue with the United States, that can convince that there is an intimacy of the defense establishment, of the intelligence establishment, etc., with no Jewish lobby in the middle. I mean, you can make a point, you can make an argument in the current contact between the United States and Israel. And this is the thing that matters. Another reason that needs to be taken into account, and I am one who opposes every single settlement in the territories and believe they need to be dismantled. This is not the question. The question is that many American leaders thought that in order to be able, this is the way they thought, not because of the lobby, in order for them to be able to have a bearing on the peace process, to influence the Israeli policy making, they needed to save all kinds of political crises on the way. And dismantling settlements, for example, would have created such a political havoc that would not have allowed later on to force Israel to go into a given concession or a peace process because of the political price. These were the considerations, not because the lobby said build settlements, don't dismantle settlements.
Okay, I've been promising Rashid a chance to get in since he gave Dennis his mic.
Give him the shirt off my back. It'd be too small. It'd be too small for you. I think that the discussion that we've just heard, illuminating, of course, it's been, shows the limitations of the debate around the lobby. Let's try and think, why are American presidents limited? Both of whom did not rely upon Jewish votes to get elected, operated in some measure in the way in which they did. And I think that's why we have to talk about a little broader understanding of this debate. Where is the lobby important? Not only, and sometimes not necessarily mainly, in foreign policy, in things like electoral politics, in things like Congress, in things like legislation, not among other things foreign aid, in things like legislation about terrorism, in things about how that legislation is interpreted, in things like look at the prosecutions around this country for terror. How many of those prosecutions deal with people who have actually attacked the United States, and how many of them have to do with
And you're saying those are the result of what?
Those are in large measure the result of lobbying and of public education. And let me get to this point. I think shaping the public debate through the creation of think tanks, through credentialing of experts, through undermining of expertise both within the government and without the government that doesn't share some certain assumptions, is part of this larger process. And it's something that's been going on for a very, very long time. Where it leads us is to the ruling of things as being out of bounds. I mean, not necessarily to the point of saying anyone who criticizes Israel is anti-Semitic, but in some areas, in some zones, up to and including that. And it mainly has to do with establishing in the public mind, especially in American political discourse, the kind of thing that's needed to get almost any politician in most states elected, the idea that America and Israel have identical interests and identical values. Now, that doesn't operate, I agree, in every foreign policy issue. But I think it is the background against which American politics function. And it's an area where, with things like work on campus, training young leaders, organizing effectively, in a way that's admirable. I only wish that other groups could do as good a job, including Arab American groups. You have seen this lobby, and two of the people who are on this podium, working at the Washington Institute and the founder of the Washington Institute, I think themselves measurably aided in this process. So we are not just talking, in my view, when we talk about the lobby, about foreign policy. Important though obviously it is. We're talking about a broader scope of a broader range of things.
Let me phrase that question in a way I think that responds to what Tony was saying. Generally, is it possible in this country to have a reasoned debate about the degree to which American interests and Israeli interests converge? Tony.
I think not. And I think the reason, however, can you hear me? The mic working? Okay, the reason is not necessarily uniquely specific to the Israel lobby. There are a lot of... I'm talking right into this thing. Can you hear me? Okay.
He's practically swallowed it.
Right, I'll swallow the mic and keep talking. Let's see. I'll try this one. No, that's right, this is okay. Look, traditionally in this country, the diasporas, whether they are Polish or Irish or Croat or Greek or others you could name, are politically far more extreme, insecure, resentful, nationalistic, irredentist, whatever you want to say, than the country that they refer to, that they refer back to, precisely, of course, because they don't live there, they live here. And so they identify with it in a very particular kind of extreme way. What is, I think, distinctive about the lobby for American-Israel relations, if you want to think of it that way, in this country, is that it has now been going on a very long time. Certainly I date it from the mid-60s, and I could say more about that if there's time later. And one of the consequences is that the issue of dual loyalty seems to be beside the point. I think that's a red herring in lots of ways. It's worse than that. I think that for many American Jews, and although I'm an American Jew, I don't include myself in this, for many American Jews, there is no daylight in their thinking between America's interests and Israel's interests. From their point of view, the interests are one and the same. So they don't think to themselves, well, let's make sure there's no criticism of Israel, because criticism of Israel is in some sense un-American. The two have blended, and that makes it extraordinarily difficult to talk about the subject. Because if you talk about the problem of our relationship with Israel, people can only assume that you have some other agenda, because it wouldn't be rational to separate the two in any other way, so the other agenda must be anti-Semitism of one kind or another. And I think what's happened is that there's a kind of codependency that's opened up between the two countries in the thinking, and I'll finish on this, that people have here about them, such that Israel encourages America's misreading of the Middle East in recent years, and America effectively conspires in Israel's failure to face the Palestinian problem head on. And it's very difficult to see in this country how people would learn to separate out the two. And this goes back, as I said, to the mid-60s. And on this I'll finish. Amos Elan, the very senior Haaretz journalist who was the foreign editor. Amos Elan.
Oh.
Amos. Back in the 1960s, was at a party in Washington to say goodbye to a long-standing Israeli ambassador. And he asked the ambassador, what do you regard, off the record, what do you regard as your greatest achievement during your time here? And the ambassador said to him, Amos, my greatest achievement has been to convince Americans that anti-Zionism equals anti-Semitism. And I think that this
Who was the ambassador?
I'll tell you some other time. This is our problem. We have to somehow unravel this connection. And then we could have an intelligent debate about what is and what is not America's interest and Israel's interest.
Tony, I want to ask you a question. The question I want to ask you, say, we're reluctant to force the Israelis to take the Palestinian issue head on. In the first Bush administration, there was no question the decision was, with the Shamir government, to force them to take the issue of peace head on. In the Clinton administration, there wasn't any hesitancy in terms of forcing certainly the Netanyahu government. We didn't have to force Rabin because he made the decision. But certainly the Netanyahu government to take the issue head on. This is why I come back to this administration. It seems to me you draw large conclusions based on the behavior of what's existed from 2001 until today. But the behavior of this administration isn't unique only on this issue. It's on almost every issue. So if you're going to project from this administration, it seems to me that you make a mistake.
I don't say that this administration, the behavior of this administration characterizes the behavior of all American administrations since we began to align with Israel in the late 50s, early 60s. I didn't say that. I do think, however, that while it's true that earlier administrations, sometimes quite vociferously in the case of the first Bush administration, said that they thought Israel should behave differently from the way it was behaving, they were not willing to force the issue. That's the point.
I'm going to let Shlomo come in on that, and then Rashid, because the question of can America force Israel to do?
Well, if America can force Israel?
Well, the Tony said that American presidents have said they don't want Israel to do things, but they haven't forced Israel to do things. And
what do you mean force? I mean,
right into the mic.
From the moment that the United States got into the peace process, as from 1977 with Sadat, many Arabs thought that the peace process is about delivering Israel. America didn't think that way. America thought that it is about mediating, trying to reach this precarious line of equilibrium between the positions of the parties. That is not forcing, that is being a broker. And the broker they were with a number of presidents, with others less so. And again, not because of the lobby, but because of the intellectual profile of the president. For example, you have two presidents, Reagan and Bush. The two of them have a worldview. One fought against communism, the other against terror, and therefore they allowed, it was their view, it is their view, they allowed the Palestinian-Israeli problem to be diluted. And therefore they did not press, because this was their philosophy, not the philosophy of a given pressure group. So that's because we are talking about your article. We are not talking about American foreign policy. I am very much in favor of this administration changing its policy with regard to the peace process. I don't believe that today the interest of the United States, as expressed by this administration, coincide with the interest of the State of Israel. But again, who decides what is the national interest? I am a minority vote. My view is not today the official national interest because I'm not in office. I am a minority. But if I am asked, I would tell you that I would not include Hamas in the war against terror, because I don't think this is the Qaeda brand, and I'm not sure that my two colleagues here, Martin, Indyk, and Dennis also agree with me. I would not see the Iraq war. I opposed it before it started, and I think it was disastrous for the interest of the State of Israel because it emboldened Iran, it created instability, and it goes against the interest of the State of Israel. If I were today in office, I would say yes to talk with the Syrians, which goes against the will of the current administration. If I were in office today, I would say yes, reactivate the peace process with the Palestinians. So it doesn't coincide. And why? Not because there is a Jewish lobby in the middle.
Okay,
it doesn't
we would elect you
because this is the worldview of this administration.
Thanks. I know Rashid has been very patient. So are you directly on this point, or?
I was going to say something.
Okay, I just want to make sure you're on this point, and then Martin's been trying to get in, and I'll go back to John.
I want to say a couple of things, so just give me a sec. I beg of you. Just a sec.
I'm counting.
I think that the case of Hamas is an interesting example. I mean, I agree with Dennis. I occasionally do agree with Dennis. That this administration is by no means characteristic of American policy on the Middle East in many, many respects. I don't think that this administration necessarily is acting in the interest of the United States or the American people, and I happen to be part of a large majority who feel that way insofar as Iraq is concerned. But I think that Hamas gives us a perfect example of how a broader understanding of the lobby explains why we are stuck where we are stuck vis-a-vis Hamas. Some of these things have now been cemented into legislation. And I'm going to tell two quick anecdotes. One about a former colleague of yours and several of ours, Itamar Rabinovich, who at the time was the chief negotiator with Syria in the bilateral negotiations and an Israeli ambassador to Washington. He came to Chicago when I was teaching there and held a session with academics at which he laid out the need to make a peace treaty with Syria. And he was met by every single one of the academics except myself with arguments which, I mean, given that this is a man who'd written a book on the Syrian Ba'ath, was the expert on Syria in Israel, the ambassador of Israel to the United States, the chief negotiator with Syria, you would think would be listened to. No, this audience, over time, had acquired an expertise through the dint of effective propaganda, essentially, which put them in a position where they disagreed with the ambassador of Israel. At one point, he turns to me at a bar and he says, "Can you help me with these people?" I said, "This is the result of decades of propaganda. I didn't do this." And I'm going to tell one more story. Excuse me, Anne-Marie.
Quickly.
It'll be quick, I promise you. When we were engaged in the bilateral negotiations after Madrid, where you were ambassador, and Dennis was involved, as were other people who we could talk about here. One of the things that I realized was that one of the considerations that the people who were serving as expert advisors to Secretary of State Baker and President Bush, George Herbert Walker Bush, and some of whom, like you, later served as advisors to President Clinton, were looking at was what was the ceiling of what you thought would be acceptable to Israel. I think in many cases you were completely wrong about that. But equally importantly, what was the ceiling which in terms of domestic American politics could sell? And here it had to do, leave aside whether you were right or wrong, a lot had to do with these things that I'm trying to talk about. A framework beyond which you cannot go, and in which you're constrained in American politics. So I'm not arguing that in foreign policy it's not possible for a president to oppose Israel or oppose the lobby. They do it all the time when they see it as in terms of their ideology or their view of the national interest. But we are talking about some things that are poured in concrete.
Okay, so from Rashid, he said that American presidents do oppose the lobby and do it all the time. I detect a certain division on this side, but I'm going to go to Martin and then John.
More division. Rashid, I think
you speak right into the mic.
You're both right and you're wrong. You're right. I agree with you completely that there are certain things that the lobby, not the lobby that John is talking about, not the cabal, but the lobby at Congress has put a straitjacket on administrations. in a way that has not been productive for American interests. That was true of the legislation on the PLO, for instance, which put the Clinton administration in the absurd position of not being able to engage with the PLO when we knew the Israelis were dealing with the PLO, because it was against our laws. And the case of the ILSA legislation here is a point where John, I do agree with John, the case of the ILSA legislation...
You want to define the ILSA legislation?
The Iran-Libya Sanctions Act was legislation which was counterproductive to our efforts to try to change Iranian behaviour, because it split us from our allies, the Europeans. And so, in that sense...
So how do you disagree?
Sorry?
How do you disagree?
I
know.
Where I disagree...
With me and with John.
Is that when the administration decides that it's going to try to achieve something in the Middle East, let's say in particular in the peace process, it will work with Israel for two reasons that have nothing to do with the Israel lobby. The first is that Israel is the one that's making peace here. It's not the United States. We were trying to get Israel into a position where it could take risks for peace that would make a just and viable solution possible. And so we had to take into account what they were prepared to do. Now, Tony has a very different approach to how you make peace. His approach is you impose it on Israel. You use the word force, you impose it on Israel. And successive administrations have made the judgment that that would not work, that all that would do would create a situation in which, rather than take risks for peace, the Israelis would dig in their heels and make us look ineffective because we couldn't move Israel. And so I know it's a complicated argument, but it's a question of how you use diplomacy effectively. And in that context, you had to take Israel's interests into account, just as you had to take Palestinian interests into account and try to find a way to move forward. It was much easier to move forward when we had Israeli governments who wanted to make peace.
Okay, so
let me just finish on this. In particular, the Rabin government or the Barak government. But when you had the change of government and you had the Netanyahu government, then we did press the Netanyahu government. And we did take a lot of heat from the Israel lobby, small L lobby. I've got the scars to show it. You know, I'm branded by them, not as a member of the lobby, but as a member of the anti-Israel lobby.
All right, well, we've got agreement here that there are things that the lobby does in Congress that are counterproductive in the peacemaking process and elsewhere. I'm going to come back to John. Then I'm going to ask the question that we started to raise, but I think it's very important, which is the perception in Israel or in this country as to whether or not the lobby actually serves Israel's interests, and then I'm going to turn to the floor. John.
I just would start by saying, Shlomo, I wish you were in charge in Israel. I think both Israel and the United States would be all for the better.
Speak right into the mic.
But your comments and Martin's comments hinted the fact that the United States has been sort of an even-handed mediator. It's tried to be fair and give both sides equal treatment. I do not think that is the case. I think the United States has been much more closely allied with Israel than it has with the Palestinians or the Arabs more generally.
John, when do you think that? All the way through?
Okay. I would note that both Martin and Dennis were key advisors to Bill Clinton at Camp David, and you, of course, were there. And Martin and Dennis are, in my opinion, at the core of the lobby. They, and I would add that I think it's no accident that Dennis's deputy, Aaron Miller, said that at Camp David, we too often acted as Israel's lawyers. It's a quite remarkable statement. Okay?
You're going to get a chance to.
So what I'm trying to say here is...
part of the lobby too.
What I'm trying to say here is that the idea that the United States has been even-handed in this process over time is wrong. Second point I wanted to make was just about the Bush administration. I think that this Bush administration gets an unfair rap because this Bush administration did try and put pressure on Israel early on in the 2000s, and what happened was that the lobby bit back. But as many of you remember, in the fall of 2001, when it didn't look like we were doing too well in Afghanistan, President Bush began to put pressure on the Israelis, and this is when...
Fall of 2002.
No, 2001.
Right after 9/11.
No, it was the fall of 2001. It was during the Afghanistan war, right? This is when...
That is right after 9/11.
Yes, this is when Ariel Sharon said that he would not be Neville Chamberlain. And there was a real dust-up. But the big fight came in the spring of 2002, April 2002, when Sharon reoccupied the areas that the Palestinians had been given as a result of the Oslo peace process, and both Condi Rice and President Bush told Sharon to evacuate those areas immediately. Sharon basically telephoned the lobby, and the lobby went to work, and 1 week later, to no one's surprise, in the Rose Garden, President Bush said that Ariel Sharon was a man of peace, and he backed off. And then there was another case in the summer of 2003 when the Israelis, much to the chagrin of the Bush administration, conducted 7 targeted assassinations in 5 days. And the lobby again went to work and told Bush that he was not to criticize this and he was to fall in line behind Israel, which of course is what he did. But the point is, if you look at the Bush administration's behavior in its early incarnation, it actually tried to put pressure on the Israelis a number of times because it thought it was very important to settle the Arab-Israeli conflict. But as is almost always the case, we're just not able to bring pressure to bear on Israel, which I believe is not in the American national interest, and which leads into Anne-Marie's next subject, I do not think is in Israel's national interest either.
Okay, we are coming to that, but Dennis...
It is... Sorry. That's not your fault. John, you sort of toss that out. You know, Bush makes a decision, but the lobby didn't like it. They call him up, and he salutes, and he immediately changes his policy.
We documented it.
Oh, come on. Jesus, that is ridiculous.
You can read the piece.
You know, it is.
We're not making this up.
John,
no, you quote selectively. You basically identify certain things that you think support your case. You ignore every bit of evidence that contradicts your case, and then you make these kind of strong statements. I mean, it is interesting. The period you're talking about is a period when there were 6 suicide bombs in 6 days, the last one at the Park Hotel on the first night of Passover. Yeah, Israel went back into the West Bank. The administration did put pressure on them. It wasn't because suddenly, Bush became under pressure and he backed off. When has he come under pressure from any group, or certainly from the Congress, when he's backed off? He doesn't respond that way. You can agree with him or disagree with him, but that's not the way he functions. Point 1. But point 2, on the issue, I just wanted to get back to the issue of, does the lobby have influence in Congress? Yes, it's a fact. They have influence in Congress. Did we have to spend a lot of time up on the Hill during the Clinton administration trying to deal with some of the constraints? Absolutely, we did. Were there times when I had to fly back from the Middle East all night and go directly to the Hill, which was the last thing in the world I wanted to do? Yes, I did. But you know something? There is a value in having to explain your policies. There is a value in having to get up there, make the case for your policies, think them through, and explain them. And actually, when you do, you're probably better off for it. Maybe one of the problems we've had in this administration is too little effort to explain policies, not too much.
So let me read you a quote from the Israeli author and commentator Tom Segev. Segev, I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. Segev. So he says, quote, "Had the U.S. saved Israel from itself, life today would be better. The Israel lobby in the U.S. harms Israel's true interests." That's from an Israeli commentator.
Well, you see, he expresses the same kind of frustration that is expressed in the article of Walt and Mearsheimer. That is, the Israelis, elected a government that has a given policy, this government doesn't do what we, Tom Segev or others, want, so this must be the blame of the Jewish lobby. And then you elect here a president, as I said, a political theologian, and he runs the policy that he runs all over the world, not only in the Israeli-Palestinian situation, in South America, in Asia, what have you. And then you are at a loss. You want to explain why the hell he behaves like in such a distorted way. So you go to the Jewish lobby. The Jewish lobby is, I'm not saying irrelevant. It is absolutely relevant. They say that it is especially effective. It may be indeed effective. It may be indeed effective. But the problem is in your political culture, in our political culture, in the kind of leaders that we elect, in our political system that is an impossible political system in terms of conflict resolution. And therefore, you find people like Tom Segev that magnify, blow up the meaning of the lobby as the obstacle. The obstacle is Ehud Olmert, is Sharon, is Barak. These are the obstacles. And the obstacle here is probably Bush and American politicians. And the lobby is there. It plays a role because foreign policy is an amalgam. Foreign policy is, in a democratic country, is an interplay of factors and actors. And the lobby is one of them, obviously. But the onus, the responsibility is on the elected leaders.
Okay. Tony's been... Yeah. I think it's Tony. Oh, go ahead.
I'll come back after.
All right. Martin and then John.
If I could just follow up on this point. I think underlying a lot of this discussion, and it's particularly in John's piece, is this assumption that Israel is... that the United States is capable of telling Israel what to do. Or in the case of Tom Segev, as Shlomo points out, that if Israel were only pressed by the United States to do what he wants it to do, it would be saved. There's this whole notion that somehow Israel is not an independent and sovereign state with a democratically elected government. The United States has relationships with a lot of countries around the world in which we would like them to behave differently. But in many cases, they have the ability to say no and to pursue what they consider in their national interest. And that's something that I think is missing from this debate, is Israel does have the ability to say no to the United States when it thinks the United States wants it to do something against its interests. Who are the people saying no?
But couldn't the...
happens to be the elected government. And inevitably, the people who aren't in the government come to Washington and say, you have to do our dirty work for us. You have to get the Israeli government to do what we want it to do. Well, that's fine. That's what Tom Segev is saying. But understand that and John Mearsheimer should understand it since he's a realist better than anybody else, that states have interests. And Israel is a state which has interests. And the United States can try to influence it because it gives Israel a lot of aid. But in the end, it can't stop Israel from pursuing settlements, not because of the Israel lobby, but because elected Israeli governments have been hostage to the settlers who have been driving this process for 30 years.
Okay.
And that's why the United States isn't able to do it, not because of the lobby.
Okay, so Tony and then John, and I'm going to go to the floor.
There's a kind of faux naive quality to that view of the way the world works. That because there are these little countries out there that behave in ways that annoy or irritate us, we try to influence them, but very often we just can't. There's a lot of evidence that very often we just can and have. And even if I base...
recent examples of how we've prevailed?
You know, one could look at one...
Sharp to stop his support.
Have you finished?
Finished? Sorry.
Okay, thank you.
Excuse me.
You're welcome. The complicating factor is not whether or not we can make another country do our bidding. It's whether, when it does the things that we don't like, we then take a position which makes very clear just how much it runs against our interests. And in taking that position, warn that smaller, weaker, very dependent country, Israel in this case, but others as well, that it's perhaps not in its interest to keep on doing these things which annoy us so much. So it's not that we're completely powerless in these matters. Let's take a concrete, recent, brief case. Many Israelis supported, an overwhelming majority actually, supported the recent incursion into Lebanon. Many people in the rest of the world thought that this was perhaps a bad idea, and many people in the United States, including people in policy-making positions, worried that this was not conducive to the long-term making of Middle Eastern peace. But what did the Secretary of State of this country say? That we should effectively stand by and do nothing, because this was, if you remember, the birth pang of a new Middle East. The consequences of this particular birth pang have been catastrophic for Israel, and that's one discussion one could have. But they are, believe me, profoundly catastrophic for this country, as well as the country I came from, whose Prime Minister backed the same position. Because we are seen then to be two things. One, completely supporting a mistaken policy by a small client state, and two, unable to do anything about it, apparently. So we are perceived simultaneously as complicit and weak. How that could possibly be in our interest defeats me. And if it's not in our interest, then why do we not do something much more effective? Why do we not strong-arm the way, for example, excuse the language of force and strong-arm, but sometimes it has applied, the way we have strong-armed some countries in Europe, which I know much more about, into backing us on the International Criminal Court. Heavy leverage, heavy financial pressure, heavy legal pressure, heavy promises or threats of the withdrawal of promises. We do it, we can do it. We don't seem to do it in the case of Israel.
Okay. John, I promise.
Okay.
Quickly.
Yeah.
Because I think that the lines are clear.
Okay. I want to go to Shlomo's point, and I want to note that if you look at your new book carefully, which I have done,
he probably knows it.
It seems to me that the arguments that you're making in that book support very clearly the Tom Segeyev line of argument that you seem to be arguing against here tonight. But let me point out that in the book, you say that there are two presidents who have done the most to facilitate peace between the Arabs and the Israelis. And those two presidents are Jimmy Carter and the first President Bush. And you say that the reason they were successful is they, quote, managed to produce meaningful agreements, right, because they were, quote, not especially sensitive or attentive to Jewish voices and lobbies. They were, then to quote you again, ready to confront Israel head-on and overlook the sensibilities of her friends in America. It seems to me that what you're saying there is that the two presidents who have done the most good for Israel were two presidents who were willing to take on the Israel lobby head-on. And that, in effect, gets back to the very question that Anne-Marie opened with.
I addressed that already when Tony, the same quotation. I hope you were listening, because he quoted the same quotation before. And I addressed
I just thought
already.
I would drive the point home.
I addressed it already.
All right.
Indeed, I believe, by the way, I would add a third president. I think that Clinton was obviously very active in trying to make peace. And very assertive in that, and I think he went further than anybody else, any statesman all over the world, and certainly in this country, in terms of an Israeli-Palestinian peace. And I repeat my point. There is a lobby, it has an influence, it has an impact, but at the end of the day, it is fairly, I would dare say, even easy, because Clinton, I'm not sure at all that he confronted any lobby. When he went to Camp David, when he suggested to transfer the sovereignty to the Palestinians for Temple Mount, for Jerusalem, all these kind of things. I was there. I never heard the lobby. I came to Washington quite frequently. I never encountered any lobby pressure. So the lobby is there. There is no question about it. The problem is, where is American leadership? And your article, more than a critique of the lobby, needs to be seen as a critique of American leadership. It is their responsibility. And whenever an American president wanted to carry out a given foreign policy, he did it, with the lobby or without the lobby. By the way, in other spheres as well. Take China with the Taiwan lobby, take what have you. So this is the question. I don't believe, and this is unlike the case of Tom Segev, I don't believe that the lobby is an unsurmountable obstacle. It is there. This is the Deus ex machina. If we bring it down or bring it up, we'll solve everything. Simply not the case. Simply not the case. It's a question of leadership.
All right. So we're going to go to the floor. We're going to give you pretty much your full 2 hours here, so we've got about 15 minutes, because I know we started late. I can see you. All right. So here are the ground rules. No speeches. I will cut you off. This is not the time for speeches. This is the time for questions. Questions are short, they're to the point, and they're aimed at one member of the panel, please. I'm going to collect about 3 questions at a time, and then I'll turn to the panel to respond. We've got to do it this way so that as many people as possible have a chance to ask questions. Okay. Go ahead.
Hello. I have a question for Rashid Khalidi. You have said that the influence of the lobby is in fact far greater than John Mearsheimer claims. Your argument reminds me of the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a book. Are there people here who believe in freedom of speech and will allow me to finish? Allow me to ask my question. It is a question. The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a book very popular in Muslim countries. How would you distinguish your views? How great is the Jewish domination of America?
Okay. Thank you. Next question.
My question is for John Mearsheimer. I want to put out an argument and get him to respond to it, if that's okay. The argument is that I feel hasn't been addressed, and I want you to respond to it, is that many people, or some people feel as if, yes, Israeli and American policy is harmful to Palestinians. Obviously, it's terrible. But they don't blame that on the lobby. They blame that on the government, and they say that they're on the U.S. government, and they say that there are alternative reasons for the support of these policies, which is simply that the U.S. favors an Israeli Sparta, which is very militarized. It's an offshoot of the American economy. It's a local police officer. So I want you to respond to that. And also, can you point to examples where the lobby has stood up to the administration and on the important issues like selling military technology to China and has not fallen in line?
Thank you. Next question.
My question is for Professor Mearsheimer. On page 147 of the 9/11 Commission report, it states that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, mastermind of 9/11, says he attacked us because of our biased foreign policy favoring Israel. So my question is, given the stranglehold of the lobby on the politicians and the media, is it ever going to be possible to have an even-handed policy towards the Palestinians and the Israelis?
Okay. Thank you. Last one, and then I'll come back to the panel.
My name is Michael Sanmaro. I'm a web journalist for ReportersNotebook.com. According to, my question is, why...
Directed to someone in particular?
Well, first I want to say that according to J.J. Goldberg in his book Jewish Power, the current editor of the Forward Jewish Weekly, he states, with footnotes, that 45% of the Jewish PAC money funds the Democratic Party for national elections, meaning congressional, U.S. Senate, and the presidency, and 25% of the Jewish PAC money is funded for the Republican Party. How can you say that Israel is not a domestic issue? And that's to Dennis Ross.
Thank you. Okay, so... Rashid.
I think the question that you heard shows part of the problem in this country. I actually think I said that the impact of the lobby is both greater and less than John Mearsheimer and Steve Walt said. I would argue that its impact on foreign policy, and I think I gave a couple of examples, is in some respects less than they would argue. And I would argue that its impact on other areas, like legislation, I specified. I wasn't talking about Jewish power. I wasn't talking about the protocols of the elders of Zion. I tried to be specific. And on public discourse, is greater. In fact, it's a subject that they don't deal with, in my view, sufficiently in the article. To talk about the extent to which the way in which people in this country are allowed and not allowed to talk about things like Palestine, occupation, Israeli policies, American support for those policies, to simply open these issues and say that debate on them is extraordinarily restricted, I don't think means you're talking about, to quote the speaker, how great is the Jewish domination of America. I think we have a problem. If I were Israeli, I would say, I think Israelis have a problem with the fact that you cannot rationally, calmly debate many of these issues, whether in the media, certainly on Capitol Hill, partly because of the much broader influence that, in my view, John and Steve talk about. I would disagree with them on many other things.
Okay.
And I don't think that anything I've said in any way resembles the protocols of the elders of Zion or anything like that.
All right. I see a good line of questioners, so I'm going to ask the responses to be as brief as we can so we can get more questions in. John and then Dennis, and we'll go back to the floor.
Yeah, I had two questions. The first one was the question of whether or not it's not the U.S. government that's the cause of our foolish policies in the Middle East, not the lobby, or Israel for that matter. And in fact, many people argue that Israel is not the tail that wags the dog. In fact, what Israel is a client state of the United States, and it does the United States' dirty work. I think this is largely an empirical question, and my studying of the issue tells me that this is basically a case of the lobby and Israel having much more influence on the U.S. government than it is the case of the U.S. government getting Israel to do its dirty work. On the second question about Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, from page 147 of the 9/11 Commission report. I actually brought a copy of that to read if it was appropriate. But the report makes it clear that KSM's animus toward the United States stemmed not from his experiences there as a student, but rather from his violent disagreement with U.S. foreign policy favoring Israel. The whole subject of the relationship of our policy towards Israel and the Palestinians and how that influenced the events of 9/11 is a subject, as the woman indicated, that simply can't be discussed in the mainstream media in the United States. And that is quite shocking, because when you look carefully at what has been uncovered by the 9/11 Commission report, as evidenced by this quote I just read you from page 147, there is a considerable amount of evidence that there is a linkage between the two.
Okay. Let Dennis respond. We've got to give time for the floor.
I'll comment quickly on that and answer the question. You know, you take one quote out of the 9/11 Commission report and say, boy, that proves that it was because of Israel that 9/11 took place. There was no peace. Think about the fact that the 9/11 Commission report shows the planning for this was being done when everybody in the Arab world thought we were going to succeed in making peace. Precisely because they thought we might make peace is the reason they were doing this. Now, in terms of the question, the money that was cited. Yes, it turns out the Jewish community contributes money for political purposes. Not the only reason they contribute money is for Israel. There are probably people who commit because they have also domestic interests as well. But last time I checked, actually this is the way the American system works. And it is interesting, I might just add, given the nature of what we've discussed tonight, we have focused on the Israeli lobby and therefore put all of our attention on Israel and Israel's behavior. Israel's behavior is also influenced by what it faces in the neighborhood. We haven't had any discussions about threats that it faces or the behavior of its neighbors because the nature of this conversation was geared only towards the Israeli lobby, in a sense, and its influence.
Okay, back to the floor.
Can I ask a question?
No.
Mearsheimer?
No, I'm going to go back to the floor. There and there. Afterwards.
My question is Ambassador Ben-Ami. U.S. government this year banned some of the Arab channels because it's related to the Hezbollah And I think some of the groups try to advocate the banning of the Arab radical channels, not just in the United States, but also all the world, in European Union and other countries. Do you think is it in the interest of Israel government to try to ban those kind of Arabic channels? And how about Al Jazeera or other kind of channels which should be through the cables or internet?
Did you understand the question?
Well, given the fact that...
We're going to hold them, but hold that one to you. The next one.
I'm very concerned about the media's ignorance of discussions such as this. I wonder if there are ABC, CBS, CNN, or Fox cameras here, or whether we'll see this tonight when we go home or tomorrow. I sort of doubt.
Can you ask a question, please?
The question to Dr. Mearsheimer is, has the media reception of your article corroborated its thesis?
Okay, next question.
I'd like to ask this question of Tony. Since Israel has the same GDP per person as Spain and South Korea, why are we giving them any money at all? And since Israel is widely reported to have 200 nuclear weapons, why is it in our interest to have the United States... Why is it in our interest to have the United States vetoing proposals in the UN to discuss that subject, particularly in that all of you seem to agree that the United States, Israel, and Iran are a central topic?
Okay. I'm not sure it was asked the right person. Okay, Shlomo, go ahead.
Well, during the Lebanon war, we tried to destroy Al-Manar television, so I guess that it is not against Israel's will to see such a channel to be closed. So I think that if you ask me if it is in our interest or not, at that particular moment during the war, it was in the interest because it was part of war. As a whole, I don't think we should intervene in that. It is an American decision. It has nothing to do with Israel. It is your policy. You are in the war against terror, in a global war against terror. We, the Israelis, should not be part of the global war against terror because we have a political problem with the Palestinians, with Hamas. We should not present ourselves as the spearhead of a sort of clash of civilizations in that part of the world. I am against that kind of vision because I think we have one particular problem that is solving the political dispute.
Thank you. John.
I think that since our piece came out, the media has paid its serious attention, the mainstream media, that is. I'm not too sure, though, that the mainstream media, has paid much attention to the two big issues that we raised. One was criticism of Israel, and two was criticism or serious dialogue about the U.S.-Israeli relationship. If you look at the recent war in Lebanon, there was hardly a piece in any newspaper in the mainstream media that criticized Israel or criticized U.S. policy towards Israel. And I don't think you see many pieces today in the mainstream media questioning the U.S.-Israeli relationship.
Okay. Tony, please, we've maintained, please be quiet.
I can't see the speaker, but would he allow people to answer the questions, even if you don't agree with them, as I often don't on this panel, please?
Tony.
I was asked two questions. Why do we give so much money to Israel if it doesn't need it? I take it that's the gist of the question. And secondly, why won't we talk and why do we forbid others to talk about Israel's nuclear weapon? Why we give so much money to Israel is a historical question. It goes back, and you'd have to tell the story, beginning in the 60s, of America's increasing involvement with Israel, which doesn't actually date back at all to the beginning of the state. But in a way, what we do now is analogous to what we used to do to France in the early 1950s. We poured huge amounts of money into France, believe it or not, which helped the French economy boom into its great post-war development, but allowed the French to divert many, many tens of millions of dollars in their own currency to fight a useless war in Indochina. We effectively underwrote French bad behavior.
Tony, make it short, please.
That's what we're doing with Israel. We are underwriting Israel's bad behavior. Why we continue to do it, I think, has been answered implicitly in the conversation here. We have vetoed many, many resolutions in the Security Council concerning Israel. The reason Israel doesn't want to talk about its nuclear weapon, officially it's never acknowledged, of course, having one, is a question that would have to be addressed to Israel. The reason we are uncomfortable with it, obviously, in raising the issue, is because effectively Israel doesn't behave in ways, with regard to this as many other questions, that we demand of other countries, both in that region and in the world. Forcing it to do so is something we've decided we don't want, in our interest as we see it, or in Israel's, and so we won't allow the conversation to come up. It doesn't look well for us, seen from the outside.
Okay.
Can I just... 2 sentences.
2 sentences.
I promise you. Okay. First of all, on the issue of aid, the fact of the matter is that Israel now receives $240 million in economic support funds and $2.3 billion in military support funds. And within the next 2 years, the ESF, the Economic Support Fund, will be eliminated completely. So in terms of supporting its economy, we're not doing that. What we're doing is supporting its ability to defend itself. As far as the nuclear issue is concerned,
I think that's what I said.
One more sentence.
No, but the question was about why are we subsidizing Israel's economy when it has the economy of Spain? And the answer is we are reducing that to zero in the next few years. The question of Israel's nuclear weapons is, I think, the critical issue. It's a very complicated issue, but since I only have 1 sentence, is the difference is the understanding we have with Israel is that Israel keeps its bomb in the basement. And that has served for the last 20 years to ensure that the Middle East has not gone nuclear until this menace of Iran has emerged. But the Arab states, because Israel kept its bomb in the basement, the Arab states did not see the need to go nuclear, and that has served the interests of the region and our interests very well.
Okay, that's a whole other debate. Last round of questions, please.
This question is for Professor Mearsheimer. In the opening pages of your paper, you state that one of the reasons America is facing terrorism and hostility from the extreme factions in the Muslim world is because of its alliance with Israel. And you imply that perhaps as a result, the U.S. should reevaluate its alliance with Israel. Don't you think there's a danger in advocating foreign policy with zero weight on loyalty and only weight on here, now, and the present, and what's good for us at this moment?
Okay, thank you.
My question is for Professor Mearsheimer, and I want to know, do you think it's possible that the majority of the American people who are primarily not Jewish, primarily don't live in New York, and primarily have never been anywhere near a think tank, neocon dominated or otherwise, might just like Israel and recognize shared values and have over the last 50 years urged their legislators not always to go with Israel in the main, but towards Israel because there was something about the place that they liked and recognized as admirable?
All right. Last question.
Yeah, hi. I write for the American Free Press in Washington, D.C. that's done a lot of coverage of this. And I have really basically one and a half questions for you. First of all,
for whom?
What would happen?
For whom is your question directed?
Okay, to the entire panel.
No. Choose somebody.
It's very dangerous.
To Mr. Dennis Ross.
Okay.
But others may comment.
Dennis Ross.
2 questions. Number one, what would happen if Egypt or Jordan or any other country in the Middle East mounted the scale of espionage operations that are now going on through the Mossad? That's number one. Number 2, don't you feel that one of the factors in the drift towards war is the growing British influence in this country?
Okay, so No, okay. I will. All right. So, quiet, please. I'm going to let John and Dennis answer. And you're going to close at the same time. I'll give everybody literally 2 sentences to close, and then we'll adjourn. But let's start. So you're going to be answering the questions briefly and closing briefly. John, you're first.
I had two questions. The first was, did I not think that terrorism was principally caused in good part by our relationship with Israel? And wasn't it short-sighted to think about ending the alliance as a result of that causal linkage that I see? I do want to make it clear that I think Israel and our relationship with Israel, especially with its policies, is one of the main causes. It's not the only cause. It's one of the main causes of our terrorism problem. But my argument is not that the United States should end its alliance with Israel. My argument is that the United States should put significant pressure on Israel to change its policies. And then if Israel doesn't change its policies, and the United States comes to the conclusions that those policies are not in its interest, the United States and Israel should go their separate ways. Second question, an excellent question, is one that says, isn't it the case that the majority of the American people closely identify and support Israel, and therefore what's happening here is that the American government is merely reflecting the will of the American people? I have 2 points to make on that. First of all, there's no question that the American people are quite sympathetic to Israel, but much of that is due to the fact that the discourse in this country is so stunted that it's impossible to have an honest discussion about Israel. My argument is that if we had an open and freewheeling debate about Israel, what you would see is that people would be quite critical. My second point on this is actually, if you look at public opinion polls on how the American people think about dealing with Israel, they're actually much more hard-nosed than what you would think, and they don't in any meaningful way mirror the policies of the American government.
All right, no reading, John, really.
I can't read any polls, but
no.
I do have a few, so I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Thanks. Dennis, and please resist the tendency to respond again.
I think the American government, and certainly all the administrations I was a part of, takes a very dim view on anybody who engages in espionage against us. So the reality is, if someone does it, they're going to pay a price with us. As for the British being responsible for our drift towards war, I suspect that somehow if Tony Blair was seen as having much more influence on the United States, he would have fewer problems within Britain. But maybe Tony Judd is responsible for the drift. I don't know.
Tony, well, I would simply say this, that there are two people in the world, to the best of my knowledge, who believe that Britain has a lot of influence on American foreign policy, and one of them is just about to lose his job as British Prime Minister because of it.
Rashid, you get a final 2 sentences.
I wasn't asked a question.
No, I said everyone, those of you who weren't, get a closing brief remark.
Okay, well, thank you. I would agree with the questioner here about the fact that many Americans support Israel because they feel that Israeli and American values are in consonance. But I think that part of the problem is that we don't have, as John correctly says, a freewheeling debate on this subject. And I don't think we realize that these values are frankly understood quite selectively. We believe that all men are created equal. It's very clear that that is not something that's reflected in our policy. We do not deal equally with the Palestinians and the Israelis, for example. We Americans believe that we should support democratic values abroad. It's one of the strongest arguments in support of Israel, which internally is, of course, a democracy. It has, of course, for 40 years ruled over another people. But leave that aside for a second.
Okay.
We certainly,
briefly.
Finishing. Thank you. We certainly have not shown any kind of, we as a country have not shown any kind of support for democracy where it comes to Lebanese democracy or Palestinian democracy over the past several months. Finally, this is a country that was created on the idea of national independence, self-determination. And while we have supported Israel's self-determination from the very instant that the partition plan was passed in 1947, I do not think, with all due respect to people who would argue the United States has done a great deal to favor Palestinian self-determination, that we've done any such thing. So I don't think that we are really applying our values in a fair and equal manner. And I really think that's because the debate is not even allowed to begin on these issues in this country.
So Martin. Quiet, please.
I don't think that anybody could go away from this evening's discussion and feel that John Mearsheimer hasn't had a chance to have an open and vigorous debate. And as he himself has admitted, his piece has been openly and vigorously debated. So I have a feeling that he himself is trying to play the underdog here, and it's unjustified. That's a reference to his paper where he claims that Israel is the underdog, and that's unjustified. But I do want to say in closing that one thing we didn't discuss here, and isn't discussed in the paper, and should be discussed, and maybe John will write a companion piece, about the role of Arab states in lobbying for American foreign policy, and their influence on American foreign policy, and their influence on the decision to go to war in Iraq. Because it's amazing that all this focuses on Israel because you can get a bit of a rise out of this, but the fact that you totally ignore the influence of the oil lobby, the influence of Saudi Arabia, which has been constantly, since Saddam invaded Kuwait, has been constantly coming to Washington and telling us to take Saddam out, and were much more important in the decision of George Bush to go to war than Israel was. And the fact that you ignore it, I think, and the fact that we never discuss it here, is an indication that you are not approaching this in a fair, balanced, and scholarly way.
Okay. Shlomo, we're going to give you the last word.
Well, some very brief,
last word.
Remarks. Of course, what was missing in this debate, inevitably, because there is no time, is that the essential equation is Israel and the Arab world. This is the essential equation that needs to be addressed. Another thing is the need to see the predicament of Israel. It's not very easy to convey that. When you have a man like David Grossman, who was a peacenik, who supported the war in Lebanon, at the beginning at least, because it was about upholding the validity of an internationally recognized border. And this was very important for America at that particular stage. I'm not condoning the means that were used, but the principle, if you want to put pressure or to deliver Israel or to force Israel to recognize an international border, you need to understand that degree of sensibility. Another brief reflection. The subsidies that will be given to Israel as from 2008, $2.4 billion, indeed are a subsidy, but they are also a subsidy to the arms industry in this country, because this is US dollar money that is spent here. And I would like to see the reaction of the arms lobby here if this is eliminated from entirely. Now, not only of the Jewish lobby.
Last sentence there, Shlomo.
Another point about the responsibility of Israel for terror. I mean, America is sharing the predicament of all superpowers in history. Ask perfidious Albion, look at the Black Legend for the Spaniards. Colossus are hated, always, all over the world throughout history. And you needed to know that. There is no historical perspective in your article. It's extremely technical, brief, encircled in an enclave that doesn't tell much about what is going beyond that. And what is going beyond that is more important than what you write about. And this is one weakness of your article. An intrusive colossus that is hated throughout the Arab world, not because of the Palestinian question, but because they support the autocrats, the Arab autocrats, just as Hamas was elected not because of Israel, but because this was a protest against incompetence, corruption of the Palestinian Authority. So things are much more complicated. This is really, I mean, you and Walt are very serious scholars, and I appreciate things that you have written in the past. But I think this is a very, very poorly written article. And my last question to you, my last question to you is, and this is a rhetorical question. I was less benign in my book to Israel's wars than you are to Iraq, to Saddam Hussein. You wrote, his decision to invade Kuwait was neither mindlessly aggressive nor particularly reckless. Saddam's decision to invade Kuwait was primarily an attempt to deal with Iraq's continued vulnerability. Can you think of some sense of vulnerability in Israel? I was less benign to Israel than you were to Saddam Hussein in your article.
One sentence enough.
I mean, I'm sure Anne-Marie is going to say something to this effect, but I just want to point out that this is, in a way, a very unusual event. It's unusual because I don't think you'd normally get this particular mix of people saying this particular mix of things on the same panel, whether it's in New York or the middle of Kansas, but certainly not the middle of Kansas. And I do think you should reflect upon the fact that it's the London Review of Books that put it on.
So, I think, in closing, it is clear that
I didn't get my.
You got yours.
You didn't answer a question.
I got you all. I told you all when you answered questions.
That was it.
That was it?
That was it. Sorry. Look, it may be that the British do have an extraordinary influence in the United States. We have had a remarkable debate. We have had, I think, the kind of debate that John and Steve argued is not had. They argued it couldn't be had. We have had it. It is clear that we could have another 2 hours and another 2 hours after that. I started by saying there was a debate we hadn't had and there was a debate that we had. We had both of those. We had others. We opened other questions, and I hope there'll be other fora. I want to thank the audience. I want to thank you for your questions. I want to thank you for your patience. And I want to thank you for really helping the quality of the debate. I want to thank all the panelists. It's been a privilege for me to listen to you, and I want to thank the London Review of Books and the Cooper Union. Thanks very much. Good night.
There'll be a brief Q&A for the media afterwards. Any media, please stick around.
You survived.
Whether that helped you debate, I think it was a good debate.
It was a very good debate. But it's impossible for us to assess, how well it went because we're participants. We're deep in the forest. We can't see the whole forest for trees.
I am looking with Al Jazeera. I just wanted to ask you, Professor Mearsheimer, what did you think was the strongest point made from Mr. Indyk, Mr. Ross, and Mr. Ben-Ami? What is the strongest criticism that you think was the most valid out of their arguments in terms of your paper?
To be honest, I thought they were all weak criticisms. And, my only regret was that I didn't have 15 minutes to answer each point because I was ready to deal with each point. But given the give and take of the debate, it was impossible to answer or address all the points that were raised. And that's the one thing that I regret. Martin Indyk at the end said that I hadn't said anything about oil, and the argument that it was oil interests, specifically the oil lobby and oil-producing countries like Saudi Arabia, that caused the war in Iraq. He was correct. I didn't deal with it, but I didn't deal with it because that's not where the flow of the discussion went, and I just didn't have the opportunity to bring it up. But I really regretted that I didn't, because I think I have an excellent answer for that.
So does that mean that you think that your article has no flaws? I just want to clarify.
No, my article has flaws. I've been in the
weren't raised tonight?
I was in the academic world long enough to realize that all articles have flaws.
Okay, but none of them were raised tonight.
I think most of the flaws in the piece are minor flaws. I think we made it, one or two factual errors. But I think in terms of the major points, we're on the money. Now, of course, people like Shlomo and others are going to disagree with Steve and me on that point. But my view is that we got the basic points right. And by the way, we're preparing a major response to all of our critics, especially to scholars like Benny Morris and Alan Dershowitz, which hopefully will be done within a month, and we'll post it probably on the Harvard website.
So why was this productive if none of the criticisms that were raised you think were valid?
Why was tonight's event?
Yeah.
It was productive because for one of the few times in this country we had a discussion of Israeli policy, the Israel lobby, America's relationship with Israel out in the open. We should be doing this more often. I mean, my basic aim here, I should say, the basic aim that Steve and I had was not to simply convince people that we're right. The basic aim was just to facilitate the debate on a very important issue. As numerous people on the panel said, it's high time that we had a debate on this subject. People don't necessarily have to agree with us, but let's talk about it.
Mr. Ben-Ami, can I ask just a follow-up question? There was obviously an absence of any major American media here, not to take anything away from my colleagues. And I just wanted to get a response to you from that.
I wish there was an Israeli media, because if I run to office, I run in Israel. Not
there is.
There is.
Jerusalem Post is here.
Jerusalem Post, okay.
So I was just curious to...
Get the Anglo-Saxon. That book will go for you.
We talk about a debate in the media, and yet there's obviously an absence of major American media here, and I was wondering what is your reaction to that?
Major American media?
American media. You're not seeing any of the major U.S. networks. Obviously, New York is a big market. You would expect that there would be significant media present here, and there's none.
Well, I'm surprised. I thought that perhaps one of the mainstream newspapers or channels would have been here, because after all, I'm not very much knowledgeable of the public debate in this country, but I assume that since this is one of the only debates of this nature, so I thought perhaps this will have some interest.
But does it reinforce the point that Professor Mearsheimer is making, that debates like this are not covered in the media, and it's
mainstream media.
Mainstream media, I should say.
Here I'm not that sure, because I saw events back in Israel that I thought are extremely important, and no media appeared because they have that particular day some other priorities, I guess. This is, after all, this is not a news item. It is a sort of cultural, social debate. It's not a news item, so perhaps I can understand the behavior of the media. It is very sad that they are not interested, but I can understand that at the same time.
Esther Kaplan from WPA. One thing that only got passing mention tonight was the rising role of the Christian right, the Christian Zionist movement. We mostly were talking about the Israel lobby as AIPAC, or the Conference of Presidents, the Jewish arm of it. And I'm interested from you, Mr. Mearsheimer, but from anyone here, about the significance of this, I mean, particularly given the composition of this administration, and how that's changing the political landscape here.
Well, I think there's no question that the Christian Zionists are an important element in the lobby. Steve and I, when we wrote the paper, went to great lengths to make it clear that we were not arguing that this was a Jewish lobby. I know Shlomo occasionally uses the phrase Jewish lobby, and I cringe every time I hear that phrase. We're talking about the Israel lobby. It does not include all Jews by any means, and there are a large body of Gentiles, the most important group of which are the Christian Zionists. And they are growing in power in the American political milieu, and their influence on issues related to Israel are very important. If you look at the recent Lebanon war, there's this new group called Christians United for Israel, headed up by John Hagee, that held a big rally in Washington, D.C. In the middle of the Lebanon war. And all of the people who participated in that conference, all of these Christian Zionists, were asked to go talk to their representatives and senators and make the case for giving ironclad support to Israel. So I think, getting back to the heart of your question, there's no doubt that the Christian Zionists are becoming an important element. And I might add just one other point. What is happening here in the United States is that the mainline Christian churches have begun to lose their enthusiasm, not for Israel as a sovereign state, right, but for Israeli policy and for the U.S.-Israeli relationship. So you see a lot of interest in divestment, for example, in the mainline Protestant churches. So what's happening here is that Israel is losing the loyalty of those mainline Protestant churches, and in their place, what you see coming online are the Christian Zionists.
I have a question. Mary Magnus from One Voice. It seems like part of what all of you are talking about tonight is a problem of semantics. That what's called the Israel lobby, I see that the London Review of Books chose the Israel lobby debate because the Israel lobby is a bit of a misnomer. It seems that some of you are trying to imply that there are people who are using the issue of Israel for their own ends or their own means. Do you feel like there needs to be a redefinition of semantics? Do you feel that these people are actually allied, or that this is kind of a fictive idea that all these people are really the Israel lobby?
That's a very hard question to answer. And I think defining the lobby, the people who lobby for and support Israel, is very problematic, because as John and Steve say in their paper, and I would support this, it actually happens to be the case that many of the major institutions of the Jewish community in this country, and the Christian Zionists, and many people whom I would affiliate with this lobby, or agnostics or atheists or whatever, have positions that are at odds with a very large proportion of the Jewish community. The Conference of Presidents, the ADL, AIPAC, take positions which, if you look at them carefully, are not consonant with the views of a very large proportion, in some cases majorities, of the American Jewish community. So clearly we're not talking about, I agree with John, a Jewish lobby. We're not talking about a group that is exclusively Jewish. In fact, many of the most influential and most important elements under this administration are those very Christian Zionists that you're talking about, and others who I think have a certain kind of support for Israel, which is entirely instrumental. It's a function of other objectives which they are trying to achieve. In particular, within this administration, I find that to be the case. So I think this question of who supports Israel and for what reasons is very complex. And it is not all to do with an Israeli lobby in the sense that some people understand it. I think that there are many false understandings of this question. I think one of the most important things to stress is the point that I tried to make. A very large proportion of the American Jewish community, according to all the polls I've seen, have positions that are at odds with, for example, AIPAC.
But just one very quick point on that before we go to Tony. If you look at the poll data with regard to support for the war in Iraq, before it happened, Jews were 10%, American Jews were 10% less likely to support the war than the body populace at large. 62% versus 52%. So as Steve and I said in the piece, and we have said on countless occasions when we talk about this issue, in no way, shape, or form was this a Jewish war. The argument we made is that key elements in the lobby, especially in the leadership roles of the lobby, which tend to be more hard line than the rank and file of the American Jewish community, were pushing this war. And again, they were not the only cause of the war. I agreed with much of what Dennis Ross said. In fact, we said it in the piece. Right. But the American Jewish community, by and large, again, was much more dovish than the American population.
And I ask you, why should the president be impressed by a lobby that doesn't represent its constituency?
Can I answer that or raise a point about that? A few years ago, had a long conversation with a very senior Democratic senator who's very active in the field of foreign relations. He's still in the Senate. And in this conversation, which was way off the record in another country, he said to me that he essentially agreed with many of the things that I'd at the time written about Israel and the Middle East and our position. And I said to him, well, you are untouchable, as it seems to me. Your state is not particularly Jewish, so the issue of your Jewish vote couldn't possibly be in play here. Why don't you speak up? He said, because if I were to speak up in the Senate, or in the context of foreign policy making, the chance that I could actually change anything in our foreign policy, or the attitude towards settlements, for example, in the occupied territories, is microscopic. But there is an absolute guarantee that I would become completely powerless within the Senate at getting anything else that I wanted. In other words, the issue becomes not what I would be able to achieve, but what it will be made very clear to me I will not be able to achieve, because other senators will be told not to vote for me and not to support me on domestic issues that have nothing to do with Israel, Jews, or anything else. if I take this position. So the leverage, and this is my answer, I suppose, the leverage is very indirect. It's not, Clinton, Bush, Senator X, either you do this or that. It's that if you speak out, take a certain position, your political power in all the other things that matter to you, which probably matter to you much more than Israel, or the Jewish vote, or Jews, or whatever, your political power will be reduced there. The guy makes the calculation, and he backs off.
Where is the new Middle East policy going to come from under those circumstances?
Good much.
I have no idea. But I was waiting for someone else, but since no one else didn't have an idea, I'll just say this. Go ahead.
Well, I think that the beginning of a recovery of a valid and viable process is for this transatlantic alliance that was broken in Baghdad to be redressed in Jerusalem, as it were. That is, I think that the Europeans would like very much to be active. There is now a window of opportunity for the Europeans to be active in the Israeli-Palestinian situation. The war in Lebanon has given them a chance because of the discredit of the United States and Great Britain. They don't have, for example, forces in the international, in the multinational force in Lebanon, because they do not have the credibility with regard to the other parties. So there is a moment for Europe. However, Europe is weak, doesn't have the American leverage. In a way, much of the criticism that is leveled against the way that America spoils Israel is justified, but at the same time, it is precisely this American policy that allows America to be the key to peacemaking. The Europeans can't do that. It is the perception that America can deliver Israel that makes it so central. And this perception is the result of this spoiling of Israel, as it were. So I think that what needs to be done, every time that Javier Solana would call me because he wanted to come to visit Israel, I will always tell him, you are welcome, but please go to Washington. This is much more relevant. That is, it is for that common European-American space to be developed and have a common strategy in the Middle East that, in my view, the only hope for an Israeli-Arab peace lies today. Otherwise, I don't see the possibility today of any kind of agreement reached in a free bilateral negotiations between the parties. It is entirely out of the question. See, I only believe in something that comes from outside, and this is how it needs to develop in a dialogue between Europeans and Americans.
Could I just say that while I wish all that were true, observing the way in which Blair has effectively scuttled over the last 4 or 5 years any common European position on anything to do with foreign policy, whether it's the Middle East or affecting America, I think Europe doesn't currently have the collective leadership or the collective sense of a common position, Solana notwithstanding, to do this. I mean, my fear is that it won't happen, though I agree it's the only thing that can.
In your paper, you emphasize that pro-Israel lobby was a crucial factor, not the only factor, but a crucial factor in pushing the Iraq war. Yet, in your talk just now, that morphed into something a little bit different, maybe more nuanced or maybe contradictory. You said, well, their priority was Iran. They wanted Saddam out, but their priority was Iran, and they went along with the administration. Going along with the administration is something much different than being a crucial pushing factor for the administration. And it sounds like there's something that needs to be resolved there.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. Let me make 2 sets of points. The first set of points is that both Israel and the lobby saw Israel facing 3 major threats: Iran, Iraq, and Syria. And as I set out there tonight, there's no question that Israel considered Iran to be the most serious of those 3 threats. The neoconservatives, who began pushing very hard for a war against Iraq in early 1998, believed that we should go after Iraq first. If you go back to the famous clean break study that was written in 1996 for Benjamin Netanyahu by David Wormser and Richard Pro was the third, was he not?
There were 6 actually.
He was a signatory. I think most of it was written by Fife.
Okay, but Fife, Wormser, and Pro.
There were several other things.
Okay, several. But in the famous clean break study, the number one target, the first target to get was Syria. So you see Iran, Iraq, Syria. Okay? So the order in which you took out those 3 regimes varied depending on who you were talking to. Okay? Now, what happens in the wake of 9/11 and in the wake of Afghanistan is that the Americans make it clear to the Israelis that they are interested in getting Iraq next. This is early 2002. At that point in time, the Israelis are saying to the Americans, Iran is actually a more serious threat. Okay? This is why I agree with Dennis. There's no question that from an Israeli perspective in early 2002, they saw Iran as a target to go after first. Okay? But it became clear to the Israelis that the Americans were going to go after Iraq first. But Iran and Syria would come later. They were 2 and 3 on the hit list, so to speak. Okay? So what happened then, and this is where my language probably wasn't terribly clear, when you compare what I said tonight with what I said in the piece as you picked it up, or Steve and I said in the piece as you picked it up. What happened was that the Israelis accepted the fact that Iran was next, but they then pushed very hard that Iraq was next. They then pushed very hard to make sure that the United States got Iraq. Right? That the United States did not get cold feet. And furthermore, they made it clear to the Americans that when they were done with Iraq, they should make sure they get Iran next. And I don't have the date at the top of my head, but there was a famous interview with the Times of London that Ariel Sharon gave in the late fall of 2002, where he made it very clear to the Times of London and to the larger international community that he expected that President Bush would deal with Iran when he was finished with Iran. Does that answer your question more clearly?
Dennis Ross pointed out quite clearly that this administration is an anomaly. It is not to be compared with administrations before it. But this administration is also built on many special relationships. And I think you pointed out quite clearly the relationships between those that wrote the clean break strategy for Netanyahu, very much of an aggressive government, as those people then working for the second Bush administration. But the second Bush administration has also been an administration of relationships, including those people, including even the money of Jack Abramoff and money of a lot of other people who have essentially financed the continued power of this administration. Many of those people do have the alliances you're talking about. Could you comment on that?
Well, as I said in the discussion tonight, I don't think there is a whole heck of a lot of difference between the Clinton administration and the second Bush administration in terms of dealing with Israel. In both administrations, the principal advisors on Middle East policy were, I think, deeply committed to Israel and in no way, shape, or form were even-handed when it came to dealing with the Middle East. I think that was true of Dennis Ross and Martin Indyk when they were serving Bill Clinton, and I think it's true of Elliott Abrams and David Wormser, who are now the 2 principal experts on foreign policy in the White House. And I want to be clear here, I think there's nothing wrong with these individuals being committed to Israeli security. There's nothing wrong with that. But the fact of the matter is that in both administrations, in key decision-making positions, you have individuals who, to use Aaron Miller's phrase, are Israel's lawyers. Now, I also pointed out in the talk that if you look at the Bush administration, the President Bush administration, how it behaved towards Israel in the wake of 9/11, what you discover is that President Bush actually tried to get tough with the Israelis on 3 separate occasions, the most famous of which is the April 2002 events. But in all 3 of those cases, and this is very easy to document, in all 3 of those cases, the lobby basically told George Bush, in no uncertain terms, that he should back off and not put pressure on Israel. Again, in April 2002, Bush demanded, and Condoleezza Rice demanded, that Israel immediately withdraw from the Palestinian territories that it had occupied. The lobby paid him a visit, and then in short order he was in the Rose Garden pronouncing that Ariel Sharon was a man of peace. There were overwhelming votes in Congress backing Israel and challenging the president, and the end result is that Bush came to recognize over time that it did not make sense to challenge the lobby or to challenge Israel. And to go back to Shlomo Ben-Ami's excellent book, what happens in those cases is usually not good for Israel, and as I argue, and Steve argues, not good for the United States.
If I may crash course in the difference between right and left in Israel, in strategic terms. And I think the left always believed that the priority is to solve the conflict in the inner circle, that is Syria, Jordan, Egypt, and the Palestinians, obviously. And then this would be the key to stabilize the entire Middle East, the broader Middle East. The view of the right was always that you need to start with the broader Middle East. That is, first neutralize the existential threats on the outer circle of the Middle East. This is Iran, Iraq, and the rest of it. And then you can proceed to what Ariel Sharon called the painful concessions on the Palestinians. So there is no question about it that the Israeli right always thought in terms of the broader Middle East, and in that sense it coincided with the views of this administration. This is, to me, self-evident. Where I differ, as I say during our conversation here, is that this administration needed much convincing in order to do that. That this is the missing link here. That is that you have created a link that is there but would have happened anyway. I mean, this was the view of this administration. They didn't need the particular lobby or Israel to convince them. Because you have advanced here a new paradigm, and you are a political scientist. You need to be aware of that. And the new paradigm is this, and you don't mention that, but you have advanced it. In fact, you have advanced 2 paradigms. The first is that the first time in history, practically, a remote country, small, has taken hostage the foreign policy of the colossus, of the empire. And you need to be aware that this is a paradigm that you have advanced. It has never happened in history. So on that light, you need to be perhaps more careful in analyzing what you have said, because be careful not to be too simplistic. The second paradigm that you have advanced is that America has lost the capacity to digest and integrate the First Amendment. That is, America cannot work on the basis of the First Amendment because the right to petition the government of the people has become the right of taking the government hostage. This is what you say, and this is the second paradigm. This is where I differ from you. I believe in the responsibility of leaders. I believe that the Israelis do things right and do things wrong. And this administration or this country, the same. We do not need to blow up the link that exists there. It is part of the game. But this almost single cause explanation is what... because otherwise I would agree with many of the prescriptions as to the solution of this conflict. As I made it very clear in many occasions, for example, if we speak about Iran, I think that the solution to the Iranian problem, again, passes through the solution of the Arab-Israeli conflict and the denuclearization of the Middle East as part of that agreement. Everybody should give up nuclear weapons, but this can be done only in the context of an overall
settlement of peace and stability in the Middle East. So I think but even if you have today somebody in the Israeli government convinced of this view, I don't see them moving this administration there, because they will move this administration only where the administration wants to go anyway. This is my thesis. They don't twist the arm of the administration. They serve with it. They strengthen a tendency that exists. They don't invent a tendency that doesn't exist. This is my point.
Could I just pick up the question very quickly, very briefly, but from a slightly different angle? I'm an immigrant to this country. I came here 20 years ago, and I got involved with the whole American policy to Israel, Middle East question, Israel's behavior discussion. Having left the country, as it were, I lived in Israel for much of the 60s, many years before. Got involved with it because I found myself in a bizarre situation, bizarre for an English person, of learning in this country of all countries. This is under the Clinton administration. This is my point. There's a continuity, which has nothing to do with foreign policy. That there were a whole series of off-limits issues regarding, not regarding Israel, but regarding our relationship with Israel and regarding Jews' relationship with their past, which was regarded as seen as part somehow of the same conversation. And when I go back to England, and I know that in the American view of things, Europe is congenitally anti-Semitic, so anything that I experience in Europe is somehow irrelevant to the conversation. But I go back to England, which is after all not Europe. And after I wrote an article here which got me a lot of flack, I went to London, and the editor of the Jewish Chronicle, which is the English Jewish daily newspaper, or weekly newspaper, has been for many centuries now, asked me if she could interview me about this. And I was expecting another one of these. How can you raise such unpleasant thoughts about the Middle East, Israel, Jewish identity, etc., stuff that you've been accused of raising in the States? And in fact, the first question to me was, she said, do you mind if I ask you first? How can you stand to live among those American Jews? And the question threw me for a minute, but then I realized we look very weird. The way we configure this conversation, the way we close things off, the way I am asked, not are you British, because you can hear that, but are you Jewish, before it's okay for me to say certain, as it were, collectively self-critical things. This is a uniquely American phenomenon, and I think it's very bad for the Republic.
And I would argue, just to complete, I think it's very bad for Israel. I think just to go to the Lebanon war, the recent Lebanon war, I think if we had had a freewheeling debate in this country about what the Israelis were doing in Lebanon or planning to do in Lebanon before it happened, and then shortly after it happened, I think great pressure would have been brought on Israel to pursue a smarter policy. And the end result would have been better not only for the United States, but for Israel. I mean, here's a situation where you have a country that faces a serious and legitimate threat, right? I don't want to make any bones about the fact that Hamas is an adversary of Israel. Whatever the causes
Hezbollah, you mean?
Excuse me. Hezbollah is an adversary of Israel. Whatever the causes of that rivalry may be. And Hezbollah has thousands of rockets and missiles that are aimed at Israel. And it makes perfectly good sense for any Israeli to think about how to deal with that problem, how to eliminate that problem. But the idea that you could use air power alone to eliminate that problem is hard to believe. It's hard to believe that a country that's fought as many wars as Israel has fought could think that air power alone could do it. And then when it became clear that air power couldn't do it, they were talking about sending in ground forces and demanding that they just be given 3 or 4 more weeks to finish the job. Well, the Israelis actually spent 18 years in Lebanon between 1982 and 2000 trying to defeat Hezbollah, and they were unable to do it. They, in effect, left in early 2000 with their tail between their legs. I think it would have made very good sense if we could have had an open debate in this country about Lebanon, and all sorts of experts could have piped up and said that Israel's policy is not a smart one. But instead, you couldn't have that, because the mainstream media is not open to letting people who are critical of Israeli policy speak. And in the end, as I say, I think this is not only not just for the United States, but not good for Israel.
So let's just end it on.
We left Lebanon in May 2000 as an electoral pledge that was taken
by our party before we went to the elections, that we will withdraw from Lebanon in a year, preferably through an agreement with Hafez al-Assad. And we went to negotiations through the Clinton administration with no interference of any lobby of any sort, and we came to a point that was very close to an agreement. And again, one of the elements that is missing from our debate is the Arab side of the equation. We encountered in front of us a Kim Jong-il, a North Korea, a Middle Eastern North Korea, and then therefore we could not reach a settlement because there was a deposit by Yitzhak Rabin that said that we are going to withdraw to 1967, and nevertheless we couldn't reach an agreement. Now this is why we needed, nevertheless, to do it without Syrian involvement. This is not with our legs, with our tail between our legs or whatever. This was an electoral pledge, and it was in compliance. You see, I'll tell you a story that might interest our friends from these marginal media, not the mainstream media. A night, one day after we withdrew from Lebanon, I came to see Arafat in Nablus, in a town in the West Bank. And normally he was a very warm person, he would hug you and kiss you, etc. And I thought, now he will, I don't know what, I mean, he will kiss me and hug me more than ever. Because here is Israel, withdrawing from Arab land, complying with the Security Council resolution, he should be very happy. First thing he did was shouting at me. He said, what did you do? Why did you withdraw? He immediately understood that this will undermine his position as a negotiator. He said, here I am negotiating with you, and 500 guerrilla fighters drove you out of Lebanon. Which means again that there is another dimension to our discussion, and that is the political atmosphere you operate within. You may be abiding by a Security Council resolution, but your neighbor sees it as weakness. And this is most unfortunate. But then I could see how the concept of an intifada was building up in the mind of the old warrior of Arafat, precisely because of the Lebanese situation. Things are so much more complicated than we like to see them. Today, can we, Rashid knows more than anybody else here about the Palestinian conditions. Today, can we reach a final settlement with the Palestinians, given, let us assume that we want to do it, but given the conditions on the ground, the fragmentation, and Israel bears part of the responsibility for this condition, but nevertheless these are the conditions. They are even incapable of putting a government together. The conditions are so much more difficult and complicated than we make them.
Thanks. So we just have to end this. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for sticking around. Appreciate it.